Teatro Thinking with Greg Scorzo.
Hello, this is Greg Scorzo, and you're listening to the Art of Thinking podcast. Today we're going to be talking to theorist and writer Todd McGowan about his book, The Impossible David Lynch. So in this podcast, that means we'll be talking about Todd's theories explaining the meaning of 3 David Lynch movies, Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, and Eraserhead. We'll also be talking about how Todd analyzes all these movies using the Lacanian conceptualisations of desire and fantasy. We'll also be talking about what Lynch's movies can teach us about politics, the superego, jealousy, love, truth, responsibility, capitalism, time off of work, and the potential we all have to follow our fantasies to the very end. This podcast contains movie spoilers.
Hey.
Hello.
How you doing, Greg?
Good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we're good.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
So anyway, I'm here with Todd McGowan, who is the author of one of my favorite books, The Impossible David Lynch, which, as you can see, I've been reading voraciously for many, many years.
It's well worn.
Yes, I've been thinking about this book for many years. I'm a huge fan. So you are a professor, a writer, a critical theorist, I suppose you could say.
Right.
Would that be correct?
Yeah, for sure.
And you have as far as I know, a podcast. Is that still going?
Right. Yeah. Why theory? I think we're about to do our 100th episode. So yeah, it's been going for I think like 4 years or so.
Oh, fabulous. So just to tell our audience, what sort of things do you discuss on that podcast if they want to check it out?
Yeah, we do a wide variety. We just do a lot of theoretical questions. Like we'll do a lot of stuff on psychoanalysis. So we're currently doing a little 3-part series on superego, ego, and id, and we've done devoted things to different Freud's writings. We do a lot on Hegel. We're working through the phenomenology of spirit, different sections of that. And then we sometimes take up contemporary like films or issues. Like we did an episode on the movie Us. We've done a couple times on classic things. Like we did an episode on To Be or Not to Be by Ernst Lubitsch. We did an episode on sports. So a lot of things, just different. We sometimes tackle things that are kind of little out of our thing. Like we did a 3-part series on Gilles Deleuze, and that was, it was a little critical, and so people that like Deleuze weren't that happy with that. So we do a lot of things, really.
I imagine you could do a 9-part series on Deleuze easily.
Right. Yeah, we could have. We had kind of reached the end of our rope. Although what's interesting is the listenership declined across those three episodes. So I think the people that would listen to our thing wouldn't be so into Deleuze, I guess, is what the truth of that probably is.
Yeah, sad but true. The more theoretical you get, the more you tend to alienate everybody except the hardcore.
Right.
But in terms of the theory that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking about your specific analysis of 3 films by David Lynch, who I think is, I take for granted, both of our favorite film directors.
Absolutely.
So the films that we're going to be talking about today are Eraserhead, Lost Highway, and Mulholland Drive. So I just want to warn anybody, if you haven't seen those films, go see them and then watch this afterwards, because there will be spoilers, obviously.
Right.
And secondly, before we begin, I wanted to ask you, how did you get involved as a theorist in the work of David Lynch?
Well, it really happened. I remember the exact point in which it happened, actually. So I was living in Los Angeles, and I went to a underground. It was in a multiplex, but it was underground in Pasadena, and I saw Lost Highway. It was a AMC, I think, at the time. I don't even know if it still exists. And I walked out of it and I was like, wow, I just have to write something on this. And so that was really, I had written a little thing on Toy Story, but it was not really that filmic. So the thing on Lost Highway was really my first, I was an English PhD, so I didn't have really a film. I had taken one film theory class, but I didn't have a real film background. My spouse, Hillary Neroni, was a film graduate school at the time. So I had some, weapons in my arsenal to analyze it, but not as many as I should have. But that's the film that really got me to start thinking about Lynch as someone to write on, and someone that I just had to, I felt like someone has to try to unpack that film, and I thought, why not me to do it? So
Yeah, that's totally understandable, actually, because I remember when it came out, I saw it in Pasadena too. I was in high school at the time. And I remember walking out of the theater thinking, oh my God, this is amazing. I got to tell everybody about this. This is like next level. And everybody I knew who knew of the film hated it.
hated it. Yeah,
Everybody was really into Titanic at that time.
yeah.
Titanic was the big movie of 97 that everybody was saying was going to be remembered for decades and decades. But no, actually, I think this film stands the test of time much more than that film. Don't you think so?
I love Titanic, but I like both actually. So I do. I love Titanic. Yeah, yeah. I think Titanic. I'll give you my little defense of Titanic in 30 seconds. So I think Titanic is about the way a feminist there's this feminist awakening that occurs through giving up the symbolic support of the father when she gives up her name, right? And then it's the whole framing story is about how she's betrayed this great feminist act by accumulating all this stuff, and then the end is this attempt to recover the feminist act by throwing the jewel into the ocean. So that's my defense of my love of Titanic.
That's a very different interpretation to how Zizek would interpret that film.
No, I know. He and I this is one of our lasting quarrels is over Titanic. The Titanic and Dark Knight are two of the big ones that we have fights about.
Well, I'll have to check it out again and see if I can look at it in a different way, I suppose. But with Lost Highway, I remember thinking when I saw it, when I showed it to other people who were like gobsmacked by it and thought it was like taking some sort of hallucinogen, the experience of watching it was so weird and so freaky to people at that time.
Yeah.
But I remember specifically showing it to like a college professor of mine who was a film teacher. And he said that one of the things that he loved about David Lynch was that David Lynch took chances in American cinema that at that time you could only see with a European director. Like there was Fassbinder, there was Godard, there was Bergman, there was Fellini, there was Antonioni. But you would never get a filmmaker that brazen with film language in America until David Lynch. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I think that's true. Yeah. Yeah. I think he almost doesn't belong in American cinema. It's hard to think of him. I mean, in a certain way, he's really typically American, right? Like like that story that he eats at Big Boy every day for a while. I don't know if I don't know if Big Boy exists anymore, but like that idea, he's really typically American. You can just imagine him drinking a milkshake or something. But on the other hand, I think you're right that he doesn't, in terms of visual and acoustic style, he doesn't fit in any American tradition at all. Even the more radical tradition, like even Wells or someone like that, I don't see Lynch as Wells as a forerunner of Lynch. I see him much more linked to like Alain Resnais, Fassbinder, like people like that. Even Herzog, maybe, like people, Claire Denis. Like I see there's much more of a link to certain European, I think you're right, directors than to anyone in the American tradition.
Yeah. So it's kind of amazing that within the American capitalist system, someone like him was able to amass those budgets and get those films greenlighted with those big stars. That's in a way a kind of achievement, which is almost on par with the filmmaking itself. Like it's a genius entrepreneur achievement as much as it is a great artistic achievement. Don't you think?
Yeah, I do think that's a great point. And I think the only possible companion in that project is Altman, right? Like Altman also had to, beg, borrow, and steal to get his films made, and they were pretty radical. I mean, not as radical formally as Lynch, but in a different way. He had a kind of aesthetic that didn't fit within what people were doing in America. So I think that's, I love, by the way, the moment at the Oscars when Ron Howard wins. I don't know if you know this, that Ron Howard won Best Director for the one with Beautiful Mind, with Russell Crowe, and when he won, you probably know this story, that when he won, the director of the Oscars for some reason cut to Lynch and Altman, who were also nominated, talking to each other really briefly, and years later, someone asked Lynch, I think it was after Altman had died, what Altman said to him. And Lynch reported that Altman said, "It's better this way. It's all nonsense," right? Like so like I like that like conjunction of those two. But that would be the only other person that I think you're right to say it's almost a miracle that he even was able to get the films made. You know, he never got. I find this fascinating. Even not adjusted for inflation, he never got as much money for a film as he got for Dune, up through even Inland Empire. So, you know, you're right. It's just remarkable that he was able to get anything to do those films.
Mm-hmm. Now, an interesting point of entry, I suppose, into your work with Lynch is somebody might say, okay, superficially, it looks like we've got two different frameworks here. There's your framework, which seems to be like Lacan, leftism, things like that. But it seems like Lynch himself has at least a reputation for being a kind of libertarian conservative who likes small town America. Do you think that there's like something in his films which is distinct from, let's say, his particular politics, which he can't even see?
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's true of every filmmaker. Like they do something in their filmmaking that's just divorced from their own private political views. And I think it's more true for Lynch probably than anyone else. I mean, although he did support Bernie, you know, he has some certain things that he thinks, you know, he has a kind of leftist, but you're right. He's generally a libertarian, and I think his films are anything but. So I guess, yeah, I think that because when you put something, this is a point Adorno makes, I think is right. When you put something in an aesthetic form, then that form has certain demands, right? And then so your own private politics can't, if you're true to the form and true to the idea, as Lynch I think is, then your private politics don't really intrude on that. So I mean, the one way that it might, I think, is that the way in which his films deal with racism is by basically not dealing with it. So
yeah, it's not mentioned.
Yeah, so that seems to me like he just like cut off that part of America, and that's a pretty big part of America. So I feel like that's one area where you could, I don't really talk about this in the book at all, but I think that's one area where you could really say that like his own political, whatever you want to call it, like naivete or proclivity, like that has impacted his cinematic oeuvre.
Do you know what's really fascinating about that, what you just said? In his private life, racism is actually one of the issues he's quite passionate about because his mother was a fervent anti-racist. And when he went to Philadelphia, he's spoken at length about one of the things that he hated most about it was that it was completely littered with racism. And yet that's the one thing he doesn't include in his movies.
Yeah, that's it. But that's interesting. But again, I would just say like, okay, it's one thing to be personally anti-racist, but I think that if you're a libertarian, you're not really anti-racist because you don't see the way in which racism is structural. It's not in, like, if you're a libertarian, you don't believe really in the power of structure over us. And so I take your point that he does have this private like recoil against racism. But again, I think if you're a libertarian, I don't know, can you really be anti-racist because you don't recognize the way in which racism is a structural thing. But again, I think your point is interesting that the one, like, it should have impacted his filmmaking in a way that it didn't.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose what I would ask you to start off with is, do you think that there is a coherent politics of sorts in his movies that you can see in all of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's a kind of like a radical leftist vision of things that is, what's interesting to me about it is it's very much inflected through this aesthetic experience, right? So the way in which we relate to our fantasies, I think he's trying to give us a whole different way to relate to them and to go through and experience our fantasies differently. And that's what I think the three films that we're talking about today all really offer that. And they're all incredible explorations of the dimension of fantasy, I think. And I think all of his films do that to a greater or lesser extent.
Mm-hmm. So one of the main tools that you use as a kind of a way of doing a cartography of his politics, or all the elements of his films really, is you use a lot of the concepts of Jacques Lacan to explain Lynch. And from what I can tell, the two main concepts that you're using are desire and fantasy.
Right.
Can you say a bit about how Lacan creates quite unique definitions of those things that are maybe not what common sense would suggest they mean in common language?
Right. So his idea is that we are, all of us, desiring subjects, desiring beings, because we're, in his lingo, we're split by language. Like we're split, he would say, we're split by the signifier. So we're always longing, we're always, again, in his term, we're always lacking, and we never can find anything to fulfill that lack, because we're never going to overcome the divide of, like, we're speaking, and so there's always something that we're missing, and we're striving for that thing that we're missing, and we never get to it. So that's his basic conception of desire. And but then fantasy, he thinks, comes along and then says, okay, there are ways in which you can actually realize your desire. So that's what all my fantasies are, fantasies of different ways in which my desire can be realized. But he thinks, for Lacan, that ultimately that isn't true. Like, even if you got your fantasy object, whatever that might be, you would still feel this, you would feel even more, he thinks, this sense of my own lack, because the object that you had fantasized about would prove to be unsatisfying. It doesn't provide that ultimate satisfaction that it seems to provide. So that's and then I make a kind of artificial distinction between the two. Like, I really play a lot in that distinction between the two in Lynch's films, as if you could, like, for Lacan, you can never really separate them, right? So, like, you're always fantasizing and you're always desiring, and they're interrelated together. But I imagine Lynch's films as this way to separate the two. Like, if you could aesthetically just divorce those two experiences. So if you could just be purely desiring without any fantasy attached to it, and purely caught up in a fantasy without any lack or desire attached to that. And so that's part of the way I read and try to think about Lynch's films.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one thing I've noticed in the way that you describe his films is you tend to associate the bits in his films that are sort of dark and slow and menacing and abstract with desire, whereas the bits that are more kind of colorful and fast-paced and loud and intense as being associated with fantasy.
That's right. That's right. So it's really, I have to say, it was really the experience of Lost Highway that got me thinking about Lynch in this way. And then I then, as I watched the other films, it became apparent to me, especially Mulholland, that, well, wait a minute, maybe this same structure, you could see it in the other films, even if it wasn't as obvious as in Lost Highway. And you're right, like Lost Highway, the beginning is right. It's so ominous. You don't really know anything. And so that's really what the way that I got thinking about it was in terms of the distribution of knowledge. Like, you start watching Lost Highway, you have no idea, like, what is this video cassette that's being brought to their door? Like, what is Renee cheating on him? You don't even know what's really happening. And you don't even know what his job is. Fred Madison, you don't know a lot of things. And then the next part of the film, which is, as you say, bright, and it's sort of overfilled, oversaturated, both in terms of color and in terms of sound and in terms of everything. And also in terms of knowledge, like, all the things that were gaps in your knowledge in the beginning are filled in the subsequent section. So even though Fred Madison has changed into somebody else, into Peter Dayton, and even the actor is different, I feel like that shift in knowledge is really what's signaled for me a move from the terrain of I'm just desiring to understand to I actually understand too much afterward.
Okay. So I think we should start with Lost Highway, since that's your entry point into all of this dialectic. But before we go into there, I wanted to quickly ask you, There is something interesting that you've said in your book as well about ordinary Hollywood filmmakers, that they deal with fantasy too. How would you differentiate between like how, let's say, a Steven Spielberg or a Jerry Bruckheimer deals with fantasy, as opposed to how David Lynch deals with fantasy in American movies?
Yeah, I think it's what I would say. It's interesting because I think people often call Hollywood a fantasy factory, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess what I would say is, unlike Lynch, Hollywood filmmakers tend to keep a little distance from fantasy, right? Like we get a little bit of it, but we don't get ever fully immersed in it. So I think that there's a way that they're by keeping us at a distance from it, they're holding us, they're allowing it to function ideologically and holding us away from the potential radicality evident when you fully explore fantasy, I think, in the way that Lynch does. So, for instance, like you don't, if you think of the end, let's take a really, what I think is an egregious example, the end of Schindler's List, where you get a phantasmatic resolution, right? Like it's the Holocaust. What good could possibly come? Well, okay, we get the state of Israel, right? Like that's where there's this pan, I think it's a pan, maybe a cut, but we get it from the survivors to the people walking, putting the rocks on the grave in Israel, right? And so that it's as if this phantasmatic resolution sews up all the problems, but that's not how fantasy really works. And so that's why I say that Spielberg and you know, I don't know, Bruckheimer's films, Ron Howard, for instance, I don't mind any of them, but they're all I think symptomatic of this. We're going to use fantasy, but we're not going to explore it. And I guess that's the difference. What I would say is that Lynch really immerses us in it, explores it, sees the price of fantasy in a way that, like Schindler's List, for instance, wants us to get the reward of fantasy without ever experiencing the cost of it, right? And I think for Lynch, we do experience the cost of it. Like that phantasmatic enjoyment that we get is always comes with a price for us as a spectator.
Okay, so is this a kind of way of saying that the price you pay for having all of your desires satisfied is you go back into new desires? So
well, that's part of it. But Greg, isn't it also that, like, think about the moment when we get this, he gets closest to his fantasy object in Lost Highway, right? He goes into that weird modern house, and then he opens that door, and it's like, and then she goes, "Don't you?" What does she say to him? She says this great line, like I think the final line is, "Don't you want to ask me why?" And the why gets
it was do you want to talk to me? Do you want to ask me why? That's what
I know. Yes, it's amazing, right? You did a good job of it. Yeah, and it's like, and it's so distorted. You have to kind of watch the film a few times to even get a sense of what she's saying, and it's not clear. Is that Renee? Is that Alice? It's not. I think it's Renee, but why is she even there? So there, you get too close, and then there's this thing. It's horrible, right? Like I think that's like you would never see a scene like that in a Spielberg or a Ron Howard film, I don't think, precisely because it shows this damaging and what fantasy, the price of it, what it costs us.
Okay. So is this kind of a way of saying, like, if you had a crush on a movie star and who always fantasized about being in a relationship with them, the worst thing you could do is get in that relationship because it would destroy the fantasy?
Absolutely. That's exactly correct. It would destroy, like, to get too proximate to the object is to have the fantasy become shattered. And it's not just that you see, I mean, this is, I think, a key point. It's not just that you see, oh, wait, she goes to the bathroom, he goes to the bathroom, like all these things that are, they smell or whatever. No, I mean, what it is that the very structure of the fantasy would fall apart, right? Because it operates through the distance that you have from the object. So what would happen, I think, is that your very sense of reality would collapse like that. And I think that's what Lynch is getting at in that great moment in Lost Highway.
Interesting. So going into the film now, we start off with that beautiful shot of the highway going really fast at night, and you hear the David Bowie song. where he mentions things like when the rain sets in, it's the angel man, I'm deranged. All these things that came from a song that was actually written before Lost Highway was written, but yet all the lines in that song, if you listen to it, they seem like they're somehow connected to the film. And especially the stuff with the angel man in particular, it sounds like the mystery man. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, music is so important for Lynch. I mean, he took a long time to thinking up this movie. Like I think he said he spent 2 years. He has a nice way of putting it, like throwing ideas up against the wall or something. So I would imagine that the Bowie song had an important impact on him, coming up with even the idea for the film. Like I think that oftentimes music, like it's impossible to think about Twin Peaks without Laura's theme, right? Like that. So there's certain things that are like the music is almost sometimes driving the narrative for him. So I think you're exactly right, that you could almost imagine that song triggered the idea for the movie.
Okay, so we go into the world of Fred Madison. The first thing we see of him is he's smoking a cigarette. He's haggard. He looks hungover. It's dark. He hears on his intercom, Dick Laurent is dead. He goes to see who sent him this message. A car drives away, screeching. We don't know who it is. Then later on, we see him interacting with his wife, Renee. We see him performing at a club in LA as a kind of avant-garde jazz saxophonist. We see he's a bit jealous of his wife. He calls her to see if she's home. No one's picking up the phone, so he's got suspicions, and he goes home and he sees, oh, there she is sleeping. So already it seems like we're in what you would classify as a world of desire, because it's dark, it's ominous, it's spacious, it feels very abstract. But what I'm interested in is, okay, so we're in this world of desire. Is this world a kind of LA film noir desire world, or is this more of like a Fred Madison desire world, and we don't see the film noir stuff until Pete? How do you conceptualize that?
Oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but I think it's, I guess it depends on how you theorize film noir. And I guess I've theorized film. I would say it's only when we enter the Pete universe that we really get into the noir world. Although, I mean, because I think noir is fundamentally phantasmatic, right? Like it's really just because it's so focused on feminine enjoyment. Like that's really the center point of noir. And I think it's usually a fantasized version of that. So I'm not sure that I mean, it is dark, of course, but I don't know that we get the like emptiness that we see in the beginning of Lost Highway. So for me, I would say that the noir world happens with the turn to Peter Dayton and to fantasy, and that what we're seeing prior to that would be like LA stripped of its exoticness, right? Or its eroticness. Like it's like there's like all the things that, like Fred Madison, when he's playing the sax at the club, he seems like he's trying to access some kind of enjoyment that he thinks exists somewhere, but he can't get it. He always feels excluded from it. And I think that's how he relates to his wife, Renee.
That's interesting. So in a way, like the freneticness of the tenor saxophone and the avant-gardeness of it is actually like a sign of impotence. That's similar to what happens with the sex scene a few scenes later, right?
Right, exactly, right. I read those about the same way, right? He's trying to perform. What's great about the sex scene is it's not totally clear. I think you're probably right that it's impotence, but it's not clear if it's premature ejaculation or impotence, right? And she gives him that triple pat on the back, which is of course deadly. Like if you've ever gotten that pat on the back, you've
like
done something terrible.
Back.
Yeah. So that's an incredible scene, and I think you're probably right. It's whatever it is, though. Either one is bad. I think you're right. So I link those two. Yeah, like even though they seem opposite, but they kind of are like exaggerated movements that profess a kind of impotence.
Now, what's interesting also about this sex scene, and this is something I notice a lot in Lynch's work, it seems to me like Fred is the protagonist of the film. Now, you might disagree with that, and if you do, it's absolutely fine, but it seems like he's the character that Lynch at least wants you to root for and see as a tragic rather than a malevolent character. because whenever a bad character who is male has sex in a film, in a Lynch film, they enjoy it like a man. Whenever a good male character has sex in a Lynch film, they do it like they're a boy. And the woman is almost like a woman seducing a boy, which in this case is humiliating because it's like a man trying to have sex with a woman, even though he's a child. And she reacts to him when he does it badly like a child by patting him on the back.
Right.
So I was curious, do you see this scene as like Fred having sex with Renee like somebody who doesn't know how to have sex, like a child?
Yeah. I think that's right. Although my immediate question to you is, doesn't Dennis Hopper is an evil figure and Frank Booth is evil and in Blue Velvet, and he has sex like a child, right? Like he doesn't he? I mean,
Well, it seems like in that case,
he's
like
constantly calling her mommy, right?
Yeah, but it's a man appropriating the tropes of childhood to gain sexual release. Whereas it seems like with both Fred and with Henry, neither of them know how to have sex. Neither of them are comfortable with their sexual feelings. In the same way that when you're like 11 years old and you have your first erection and you see women as sexual for the first time, you don't really know what you're doing. And it's almost a discomforting experience. And it seems
more
like
than almost. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So anyway, we get in that scene a dream sequence, which is quite fascinating, which he relays to his wife after they have sex, where he's walking around his house. It's even more dark. There's pools of smoke coming out of the walls everywhere. He's looking for his wife. He's saying, where is she? She can be heard in the off-screen background saying, Fred, where are you? Then he finally sees her, but she's somebody else, although from our perspective, it's still Renee. And then it looks like he tries to attack her in relaying this memory of trying to attack her for reasons he doesn't understand. He has a panic attack right there. Then Renee in real life tries to comfort him. And when he looks at Renee, he sees the face of the mystery man.
Right.
What do you think's going on there?
Yeah. So I read Mystery Man as a superegoic figure, a figure of superego. So superego emerges how? Like it emerges when you abandon your desire. Like you abandon your desire, that creates this figure of superego. And this is a point at which he can't sustain this this non-knowing, right? Like he's trying to find a way to desperately trying to solve this problem of knowledge. And so this is the first inkling of this emergence of superego in the face of Renee. So I think that, to me, that's how that makes sense to me. Like it's the moment at which he gives up on that non-knowing of desiring, and all of a sudden, so it's almost like the fantasy is intruding into the world of desire there, right? Because he's trying to solve that problem of her desire.
So do you think Fred's superego is angry at Renee?
Well, it's interesting. So superego drives you to violence usually, right? So it's constantly, superego is constantly upbraiding you. Like it's the way that you upbraid yourself. And Freud is very good, and Lacan, both of them are they talk a lot about this figure. And so it's something in your psyche that represents an external authority that then wants you to discipline yourself in some way. It's upbraiding you, drives you to act out violently. So if you can think of any kind of violent acting out, not any kind, obviously there's certain psychotic ways, but a lot of times it's driven by superego, by the sense that you're not doing enough, you're not getting what you should, you need to do more. And then that constant drive, that constant, on your back of the superego is what then drives you to violence. So it's not so much that the superego is targeting Renee, it's that it's targeting Fred for his failure to enjoy Renee, right? Like he hasn't been adequate. So that's why it comes after the failed sex scene, right? Like it's this, it emerges out of this sense of your own failure.
What's also interesting about that dream sequence is, although he is relaying to her how he, for reasons he can't understand, he tried to kill her, but he also says, this person I tried to kill wasn't you. It looked like you, but it wasn't you. but to us, it looks like Renee. What do you think's going on there?
Right. I mean, I just think he's denying his own. He's trying to, I think I just read that as pretty straightforward, that he's denying his own violent tendencies toward her, right? Like he's displacing it onto someone, this other figure, but it's really Renee that he targets.
Okay, so shortly before that happened, we got our first tape, which was just a very ominous set of images of the outside of the house, and it looked like a kind of a slow zoom. And then Renee said quite casually and quite ridiculously, "Oh, looks like it was a real estate agent who sent us these."
Right.
And then they get this second tape, which shows them sleeping from an overhead angle. And they're thinking, well, how could somebody get in the house and do that unless they snuck in while we were asleep with some sort of a camera, or they actually floated above us? So it almost suggested in this second tape, there's some sort of a supernatural presence that created this video. And then they call these two detectives who do next to nothing to actually illuminate what happened or how they can protect themselves. But Fred does say something interesting to these detectives during this conversation. He says, "I like to remember things my own way, not necessarily the way they happened." Do you think that's a clue to how to interpret the events of Lost Highway?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that he's telling, I think that lets us know that we're within his psyche in this film, right? Like that's Lynch's way of saying you should read what happens as we're within the psychic experience of Fred himself. So I think that's right. And it's interesting that again, like to me, even the videotapes, those are indicators of superego, right? Like superego keeps a watch over yourself. So the presence of the videotapes, they couldn't, as you point out, no one could have filmed them except Fred himself, right? Like they're his psyche filming himself, right? In his failure to, so the very presence of the videotape is already this sense that I've betrayed this position of desire by wanting I want to know, or I want to get relief from it because it's too horrible to live with.
What's interesting about that is there is a suggestion that there are some things that happen in the film that are not a product of how Fred wants to remember them. Like, it would be bad to interpret the film as one in which maybe he didn't kill her. Maybe that's how he likes to remember it. It seems like you're suggesting that you think he really did kill her, that's an objective fact, independently
right.
of how he sees
things. That's right. Like, I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. Like, I don't think if we are seeing most things through Fred's psychic structure, that means we can't decipher what actually happens as well. Like, I think both things can be true, right? Like you can see, I mean, that's how we experience the world all the time, right? Like we see it through our own psychic perspective, and yet there are certain things that we know are real and true. So I think it's the same thing in Lost Highway. Like I think we can decipher through the way other characters act, through the formal structure of the film, we can understand what's really happened and what hasn't happened.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because one of the things that I always wonder about this film is how metaphysically open it is. So you could say, for instance, that the mystery man is the superego, but you could also say, well, it is the superego, but he also manifested himself as a real being that other people saw at the party, and he was supernatural, even though he's the superego too.
I think I think that this is Lynch's psychic realism, right? Like, because superego does manifest itself in other people that were around, right? Like, think about the lynch mob, right? Like the lynch mob, when you're I mean, I've never been in a lynch mob. I'm just supposing, but when you're in a lynch mob or any kind of mob, like you're driven to act in a certain way. Okay, let's just take something a little more innocuous. Like you're at a sports event, right? Like you don't, all of a sudden people are standing and cheering, and you don't necessarily want to stand and cheer, but there's a superegoic force of really present in people around you that's pushing you to do that. So even though it's your own superego, it still has this external manifestation. So I would say again, like that party scene is just real. That's Lynch's realism, what I would call psychic realism. Like it is true that we experience certain external figures as superegoic vis-a-vis us. It's not, I don't think it's like magical. I think that really happens.
Interesting. So is that why there isn't like a cutaway shot in that scene to indicate Fred's hallucinating and he's talking to somebody that isn't there?
Right. Like, and I think other people see him at the party, right? Like, because that's how like, I can experience an encounter with my unconscious in somebody else, right? And everybody else sees them, but for them, they don't see my unconscious in that person, like, or they don't see my fantasy in that person. They don't see my desire. They don't see my superego. So I think that happens all the time to us.
So that's fascinating. So we could have a really kind of metaphysically present, objectively verifiable, intersubjective superego of one person.
Sure. Yeah. I think Lynch is really into that. I mean, I think he gets that, and I think that's why I think in a strange way his films are realistic. Like they're about the way in which our psychic structures are all the time manifested and showing up in our social reality.
That's interesting. So when we go to the party scene, right, Fred sees that Renee is hanging out with Andy. It suggests that Andy is maybe some sort of a shady figure at this point. We don't know exactly how, but we know that Renee's having a good time with him. Renee might be in some way sexual with him or other people around him, something like that. She seems quite distant to Fred. And then Fred meets this guy, our mystery man character, the superego, who's metaphysically real, with a white face. And he says, I'm at your house right now, to Fred. Yeah. Fred thinks a bit, it's a joke at first. And then the mystery man says, call me. He gives him his phone. Fred calls his own house, and then the mystery man picks it up. So the mystery man has somehow demonstrated to Fred that he can be in two places at once. Fred's a bit freaked out and says, what the hell are you doing? And the mystery man said, well, I'm in your house because you invited me. I don't go to places where I'm not invited. What do you think he's trying to communicate to Fred in this scene?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to me, this is the scene that really ensconces him in the role of superego, right? So I don't go where I'm not invited. Superego develops because of our own psychic structure, not because something's been forced on us, right? So that's crucial. And then it can be ubiquitous. It can feel ubiquitous, right? Like it can be in this external figure. It can be within. It can be So that's what I think. To me, this was the one, maybe not but one of the decisive scenes of the film for understanding how Mystery Man functions psychically for Fred, right? That he can be, and especially that line that you cited, I don't go where I'm not invited, right? Like that suggests that it's something in Fred that brought him, that caused this whole, you could almost say like this home invasion. It's caused by Fred himself and how he relates to his desire.
Do you think the mystery man in this scene is entering Fred's world to try and get him to see something or do something? Or is it just to taunt him?
Well, I think it's all to push him to, I think what the superego wants is to push you to this violent acting out. So I think it all leads up to that, which is the pivot scene in the film, right? It pivots between Fred's life and then Peter Dayton's life.
Interesting. Also, what I find fascinating is when the mystery man goes out of frame, and we might think, okay, this maybe was a hallucination that Fred had. Then we meet Andy, and Andy says he knows this guy. There's a cutaway of the mystery man talking to a woman on the staircase. Other people can see him. He's a friend of Dick Laurent's. And then Fred says, but Dick Laurent is dead. And then Andy says, how do you know Dick? How do you know he's dead? He's not dead.
I know.
How are all these characters connected in this way with the superego, you think, of Fred?
Yeah, I think all of those, it's interesting. So they're all part of the way, that whole psychic, what would you call it? Like a constellation of characters are all part of the way that Fred is betraying his desire. Like he wants to nail down like what draws him to Renee is precisely the mystery about her, right? Like this thing that can't be known about her. And all these figures are attempts for him to nail it down, to know that thing and to eliminate that part of her that he can't know. But of course, if he eliminated it, she would cease to be desirable to him. So that's why it really represents this bind for him, that like, and he finds he can't eliminate it, and so then he tries to, or he does, kill her.
Mm-hmm. But I suppose what I'm curious about is, why is, at least in the first half of the film, it seems like his superego is friends with Dick Laurent and friends with Andy. How can that work?
Well, I think that the what it is, I think, is a way of thinking about the relationship between superego and these figures of fantasy, because they're all, so superego really fuels our fantasizing too. And I think that's where that to me is like, because if you read the second half of the film as this fantasy structure, these are characters from that second half that have seeped into the first half. So it's through giving in to the inevitable, giving into superego, that we construct a fantasy that gives us relief from the desire. Of course, in real life, that never happens, because all these things are operative at the same time. So the claim is that in Lynch's film, he's trying to show these separated in order to allow us to understand them better.
Interesting. So is that maybe why Andy's house is exactly the same in the second half of the film as it is in the first? Is this the first time we're seeing the LA Noir world?
That's right. That's right.
Interesting. Oh, so in a way, like Andy's house is a portal between the world of desire and the Noir world.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we're almost and Fred experiences that party as it's almost what that next world is going to look like, right? Like the way Peter experiences that next world.
Yeah, it's a bit darker, but yeah, it does seem like it's moving in that direction, definitely. Yeah. So then he goes home. Then it gets really dark in his house. He hears Renee calling him at some point later in the evening. We see a shot of him walking into darkness, looking at a mirror. Then there's this other shot where he's walking in his living room. It's really darkly lit. We see him, and then we see another figure behind him. Presumably, when you first watched it, you think, oh, it's the mystery man. Right. And then the next scene, we see him playing a tape of him killing his wife, or having killed his wife, where he's covered in blood, she's covered in blood, she's completely disemboweled. He's, completely, it looks almost like he's possibly being framed. Like he doesn't know or remember that he did this. You don't quite see him killing her, so you're wondering if maybe he was put in a situation after she was killed and got smothered with the blood. There's this element of, did he or did he not kill her?
Really? You don't see him? Isn't he chopping with the knife? I thought you kind of see him doing that.
No, you see him. I watched it last night actually, because I didn't remember which one it was, because I had memories of him chopping her with the knife too. Yeah. But when I watched it, it wasn't actually there.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah.
So you see him covered in blood next to her, ripped up in pieces. They're both covered in blood, and then you see kind of close-ups of his face in pixelated form, and then kind of film of the same thing very quickly. But you never actually see him killing her.
Oh. Yeah, I misremembered the film. That's funny. I've seen the film 25 times probably. Yeah. But I guess, so what's your idea? Your idea is that he's framed for it by
superego.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think it makes sense to think of it that way. Like, in a certain way, that it is the superego that's committing the crime, right? Like, it's your superego that drives you to the crime, and so you pay the price for the crime of the superego. I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
Now, what's interesting also is he very quickly goes to prison, is sentenced to death. It seems like prison itself is another desire world initially. It's not like a Noir world. And he's just sitting looking up at a light and having these flashbacks of, blood and blurry images, and having headaches. and talking to prison guards who speak very slowly. And then he has a really bad headache one night, and he has this vision of the mystery man in a burning cabin. The cabin is burning in reverse. The mystery man walks out on the plank of the cabin, smiles at him, like, goes back in, and then suddenly there's this big transformation where his face opens up and there's all these flashing lights, and we see this kid in a leather jacket with lightning and thunder suddenly switching places. And then in the next scene we have a lighter jail, and suddenly we have Pete instead of Fred.
Yeah.
So what I want to ask you is, what do you think is the significance of the superego coming out of the cabin before this happens and smiling at Fred like this?
Well, I think the idea, I would say the idea is this, that it's superego that really conducts this movement from the world of desire to creating a fantasy. So he's the agent really that propels the creation of a fantasy, which gives you respite from the desire. And that's why there's something, even though I will claim ultimately in this chapter that and throughout the book, that fantasy, there's something traumatic about fantasy too. Initially, it seems like respite from, just like superego is, like respite from the torment of desire. And so that's, I think, that's why it's Mystery Man or the superego that's the vehicle for that.
Interesting. So do you think that this fantasy is something that Fred is requesting and the superego is saying, sure, I'll do this for you? Or do you think this is something the superego is doing to Fred?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, I think that it's almost, here's how I would describe it. It's almost like superego is a kind of conduit into a fantasy world, right? Like it's not the agent necessarily, but kind of a conduit that helps push us into a certain fantasy structure and sustain that fantasy structure.
Yeah, the reason I asked that question is actually because of Mulholland Drive. So it seems like, and we'll talk about that movie in a minute, but it seems like the Diane fantasy of Mulholland Drive is her very consciously righting the wrongs of her life, giving her exactly everything she wanted that was the opposite of what really happened. Whereas it seems like Pete isn't really like that for Fred. It seems more like it's kind of allowing Fred to discover his desires more than it is trying to kind of rewrite everything to make it perfect.
Right. It doesn't, that is true. It doesn't make it perfect, but it does answer all the questions of desire, right? Like everything that, and this is what I love about the film, I think it's structurally so well put together that everything that was unknown in the first part is known in the second part, not in a necessarily, just like you're saying, not in a comforting or reassuring way, unlike Mulholland, which is, it's amazing, right? Like what she gets, she becomes this, how she succeeds, a Hollywood star, she discovers a love affair, it's all great, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so it's a different way of looking at fantasy for sure, but it's similar in the sense that it responds to something that's unknown and fills it in. So I think that's the key thing.
Interesting. So then, okay, we see we're now in the world of Peter Dayton. Even the jail is lighter all of a sudden.
Right. Right.
He gets picked up by his parents. Gary Busey is his father in a leather jacket. And he goes into this world, this sort of sunny LA world, which I find quite fascinating because it only, at least it seems to me like it only becomes LA noir with the introduction of Dick Laurent.
Right.
But before that, it's almost like a sitcom world. When you see his parents watching the documentary about strawberries, when
he's laying out in the sun, right?
Yeah. It seems almost like it's jokey. Do you get that impression?
Yeah, absolutely, right. Like that's, so fantasy has both those dimensions, right? Like it's this, and I think that's what Lynch likes about it. It has this really positive, bright dimension, and then it has this underside to it. So that what you've been calling the LA noir, like that, those two aspects are both crucial to fantasy. Like it has to do both things, or else it doesn't work.
Now, one of the interesting things about the Pete fantasy before we get Dick Laurent is it seems like we have a strange kind of inversion of Fred and Renee. Pete has a brunette girlfriend called Sheila, and Sheila is talking to Pete like Sheila feels like he's pushing her away, like he's not giving her attention, like he's bored of her almost, and she's upset by it. And that's exactly what Fred is feeling about Renee in the first half of the film.
Right, right.
So it's almost like the first part of his fantasy, maybe that he enjoys, is the idea of having a girlfriend that he can treat the way that he feels like he was treated by Renee. What do you think of that?
No, yeah, absolutely right. I think it's absolutely right. But again, it's like fantasy does both things. And I think as we get to Mulholland, that'll be clear, right? Like fantasy on the one hand gives us these, what we might call like imaginary satisfactions, right? Like the like reversals, like you just described. And then it also allows us to encounter these excessive, obscene things that would be totally absent from our world of desire, our social reality. So fantasy has a double function.
So as soon as we get the gist that Pete is a ladies' man and he has sex with a girlfriend he treats like shit, and the cops are, these new police officers are tailing him and they're envious because he's so good with the women. And
Right.
then we get like that he's an auto mechanic. His boss is a kind of disabled Richard Pryor. And then we meet the man called Mr. Eddie, who we find out by the end of the scene is Dick Laurent. Dick
Right.
Laurent takes him out on a kind of a weird sort of joyride so that he can hear the sound of his engine to fix it. And then he has an altercation with a man who was tailgating. Dick Laurent violently beats up this man in a way which is quite, terrifying. And then he offers Pete some pornos. Pete at the end says, no, thank you. So we know that, Dick Laurent turned out to be in this other world, a really vicious, horrible gangster. He runs some sort of a porno kingdom. But what's interesting about Dick Laurent is, I don't know if you feel this way, I find the Dick Laurent sequence almost like a parody of Frank Booth. It's almost like sitcom Frank Booth. It's funny in a way that Frank was not.
You don't think Frank Booth's funny?
Not quite, no.
Yeah, I think he's funny, but I see why you would say that. And I think that that there's a kind of maturity to Lost Highway that doesn't exist in Blue Velvet, right? Like there's a kind of a sense of he's really committed to exploring that that fantasy dimension of that figure. Like he's not, and so that would I think explain the irrealism of Mr. Eddie vis-a-vis Frank Booth, who seems more excessive, but also more realistic, probably, right? Like when he says a bullet, like your love letter is a bullet straight through your your head or something. I don't know, but that there's a kind of menace. I think you're right that whereas even when Dick Laurent or Mr. Eddie is beating up that motorist, there's still something much more comic about that than Frank Booth. I think you're right, and so I think that's how we know we're in a fantasy world.
Mm-hmm. So what's interesting to me is it seems like when the Pete world stops being kind of a jokey sitcom film noir and becomes a real film noir where it stops being funny is when Alice emerges. And Alice is Patricia Arquette. She's blonde instead of brunette, but you can tell it's the very same person. It's very much similar to Vertigo. And what's interesting is she starts to seduce Pete. They have this sexually amazing affair, let's say, this really satisfying sexual affair where they have to run away from the gangster mall, and kind of running away from Dick Laurent and knowing they're in danger is part of the fun of it and part of the thrill. But suddenly we're very, very serious now, and we're very, very sensuous. It's no longer this jokey thing. What's interesting about Alice to me is she has two things in common with Renee, even though superficially she's the exact opposite. The first thing is her and Renee are both very introverted characters who speak very little. Even in the fantasy world, she speaks very little.
Correct.
And the second thing is they're both really, really cold. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, I mean, well, you didn't say though. The other thing is that Alice, we know all the things that were mysterious about Renee. Alice, there is a truth. We know the backstory to her, right? So like the relationship with Andy, all this, the relationship with Dick Laurent, all this stuff we know. But I think you're right that the coldness is really important, and it suggests that there's the coldness allows for the fantasy to be put on the person, right? Like that the cold, distanced persona then gives a lot of space for other people, Peter slash Fred in this case, to project their own fantasies onto that person. So that's the way I read the coldness, as it's a kind of like creates an opening for that fantasizing by Fred or Pete.
Interesting. Is that also why she says very little, is both characters?
Yeah, exactly. Same thing, right? Like it gives the space for fantasy to develop.
That's fascinating. So also what's interesting about the film is you can sort of see on the one hand that Pete has good reasons to stay in the good graces of Mr. Eddy. And he knows he's risking quite a lot, potentially death, by being with Alice. But he's also having fun having this illicit affair where he knows he could get killed at any moment.
Right.
But at some point, it seems like the danger overtakes the fun. And when that starts to happen, then the fantasy starts to unravel. And then Pete starts to see something about Alice, which is very similar to what Fred suspected Renee had about her, or Fred suspected was true about Renee. And that is that Alice is a sexual exhibitionist.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right, that she represents a kind, and again, I think this is how it's exploring his fantasy, that you go into the fantasy so far and then you encounter this thing that will destroy you. And that's what I think, in a way, I think that's what Lynch is, that's the ethical position of the film, right? Like you have to follow your fantasy and see where it leads. And that's what he wants to show in the film.
Now, what's really interesting about Pete's character is he's the opposite in the way he reacts to this as most people, I would think. Most people would think, okay, my girlfriend's a sexual exhibitionist. She may have started in porn in the past, whatever. Maybe it's sexy, but she's not doing that now. But I really don't want to get killed by Dick Laurent.
Right.
Whereas Pete reacts in the opposite way. I don't mind getting killed by Dick Laurent. I don't want my girlfriend to be an exhibitionist. Why is that?
Well, again, I think like she's the center of the fantasy for him, right? So the enjoyment that she provides for him trumps anything like wanting to survive, right? Like I think that's one of the points in all of Lynch's films, that our enjoyment is always more important than our survival for him.
Interesting. That raises another interesting question. Do you think that on some level, Pete enjoys pissing off Dick Laurent?
Of course. I mean, I think the fact that he's, I don't know, what would you call it? Like cuckolding Dick Laurent is, I think, part of what makes Alice appealing. Because, of course, as Fred, he was the opposite, right? Like he was the one being cuckolded. And so now he gets to reverse it.
That's really interesting. So what do you think is the relationship between Dick Laurent and the mystery man?
Yeah, I think that's a big question in the film. I guess there's a way, I think, that the one mitigates against the other. Like they clearly can exist sort of in the same space, but I think that that figure of the obscene father is fueled by the superego. And that's why they say we can really out ugly them some bitches or something. That's what Mr. Eddy says to him, I think. So there's a way in which they're in allegiance, but there's also a way in which they're at odds. Like that finally superego has to eliminate that obscene, like that obscene figure ultimately becomes threatening to the structure of the superego. And so I think that's why he has Fred kill him at the end.
Interesting. Do you think that there is a sense in which Alice got some agency here, where she's sort of leading Pete from fantasy deliberately back into desire?
Yeah.
By making Pete go back into the first movie.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, Greg, like she's the one that forces that confrontation. Yeah, I think that's totally right.
So what is her motivation in getting Pete to kill Andy, who is from the first half of the film, in the house, which is from the first half of the film? What is her motivation in doing that?
I think that Andy represents, I mean, I think it's, in a way, it's phantasmatic for Peter, right? Like Andy represents a barrier between Peter and the object. And so this is why the logic of fantasy it has the kind of internal contradictions, right? Like you enjoy the barrier, and yet you're trying to constantly eliminate the barrier to get the object without the barrier. So that's why I think that's why he's drawn to get rid of Andy, so he can have unimpeded access to the object. But then what's great about the film is it shows what happens when you get unimpeded access to the object back out when they go out into the desert. It's one of, you saw it in the theater, so you know this. Like when you watch that scene in the theater, it's not true when you watch it on a home screen, unless you had a huge home screen. But you have to turn away from the screen because it's so bright. Like it's almost like Lynch is just projecting pure white light onto the screen. It's impossible to keep looking totally at the screen. And so I love that scene for that reason. And it's showing like once you get too proximate to that fantasy object, then everything it's like causes a collapse. That's why she says that great line right when that scene happens. He's like, I want you, I want you, I want you. And then she stands up and goes, you'll never have me, right? Like that is you get so close to the object, and then the object falls away, and then it reverts back into this figure of superego.
That's interesting. So before that happens, when we're still at Andy's house, there's a couple of things that happen in that scene that are really interesting to me, that very mysterious. So the first thing is we see a photograph that shows Alice and Renee next to each other,
right?
That Pete sees. And when he says, is that you? Alice says, that's me. And she points to herself and not to Renee.
Right.
What do you think is the purpose of that photograph?
Yeah, I think it's to show us the way that these two objects get, they both have their own coherence, right? And that there's that for him, like part of it is the way in which the fantasy is crumbling, right? Like all of a sudden there are this figure from the first part of the film is intruding into the fantasy through the picture. And then in the room, again, that's that great scene that we talked about earlier, that I think that's supposed to be Renee. And so again, I think there's this sense that the object, that he's getting too close to the object. So this, like, as long as Renee or Alice has the fantasy form of Alice distant from Renee, then we're safely within the fantasy. But when she starts to like the distinctions, like all of a sudden, it'd be like, you're having sex with someone and all of a sudden they start to resemble too much your actual fantasy, the person you're fantasizing about. That's a disaster, right? Like then that's kind of what happens to Peter in that scene.
What's also interesting in that scene as well is, and this is maybe the element of the film that no one I've read has ever talked about, but when we see the depiction of porn in Lost Highway, when we see Alice as a porn star, that first Peter sees projecting on Andy's wall, I think, and then we see her again in a later scene as Renee in porn. Mm-hmm. Porn almost seems like a third world. Like there's the world of Pete, the world of Fred, and the world of porn in Lost Highway. It's this really kind of almost like satanic world, where sexuality is coupled with cuts of violence and death.
And like, is it Rammstein that's playing? It's
Rammstein.
Yeah.
It sounds like, I can't do it because I'm not German, but it's really, really satanic feeling. And when Pete has his nosebleed and he goes upstairs and then he sees Alice in red, or Renee in red, whoever it is. Yeah. I wonder if that's a third Patricia Arquette from the porn world. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think the Patricia Arquette from the porn world is Alice. I think that it's just like, that's again, like, like people fantasize about, especially today, like every porn is at everyone's fingertips. Like people fantasize about porn, but they don't want to actually get too close to it. Like the whole point of it, I think you're right to say it's a kind of third space, but it's within that fantasy world. But he's gotten too close to it. Like he wants the porn there as a kind of background, not as something that he has to actually confront, right? And so that's what's really dramatic. Like it's one thing to watch a porn scene, it's another thing to be thrust into it and say, okay, now you're up, like you got to perform in it, right? Like I think that's what we're seeing in those moments. I agree, like horrific. I agree, like that. I don't think I still, if I hear Rammstein, I still have this trauma associated with Lost Highway to that, and I imagine there's that porn on the window, on the wall. Like I think you're totally right to describe it as this horrific kind of third space. Yeah.
And the other reason I find it a horrific third space, and this maybe deals with the way the film deals with male sexuality, is it feels to me like one of the things that can make porn creepy to watch is you worry about the performers giving you pleasure in ways that they might either disapprove of, look down on you for enjoying, be doing because they're on drugs, be doing because they've had trauma. You almost worry when you watch a porn film that the actress you're getting off to might say to you, do you want to talk to me? Do you want to ask me why?
Right. No, that's really good. I think that's really good. There is that like, I mean, I think one of the appeals of porn is that no one talks back to you, right? Like unlike in an actual sexual act when people talk back to you. So I think that's what Lynch is showing. He's like giving you porn with someone talking back to you again, which I think bespeaks the real radicality of his vision in this film. I think it's one of his most radical films.
Yeah. So anyway, after they finish up with Andy, Alice says we have to go to a fence. So she's bringing him to the cabin he saw in his vision. She's literally bringing him to the superego, the mystery man. Why is she doing that in your view?
Well, I think again, like she's going to take him to this ultimate point where he could really have the object. And I think from her perspective, it's appealing too, right? Like she gets to, it's the ultimate, what do you call her? A sexual exhibitionist? It's the ultimate, like she gets to bring him to the point of the ultimate pleasure and then deny it to him, right? And that's what she gets to do in the what basically is the ultimate scene of the film.
Yeah, and in the sex scene that you're describing where Pete and Alice have sex waiting for the mystery man, although he doesn't know it's the mystery man, and it's in the desert and it's beautifully lit and you hear Song of the Sirens. I remember when I first saw that, I remember thinking, why are we watching another sex scene? But when I watched it a second time, it sort of became clear that this was different to sex that we'd seen earlier between Pete and Alice. This was making love.
Yeah.
So it was more cruel to say you'll never have me to someone you've just made love to, as opposed to somebody you've just had sex with, even good sex.
No, agreed.
What do you think about that?
Agreed. Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's right. I think it's like, again, I think the object gets off on the cruelty, right? Like you're made into an object and then you get off on the ways in which you can be cruel to the subject. And I think that's what happens there. I think you're right.
Do you think that the reason she did that was to be cruel and then just wander off? Or do you think she deliberately did that to turn him back into Fred?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Like that there's a way in which he's exhausted the fantasy narrative, right? Fantasy is always a narrative, and so it has a certain trajectory and then a certain end point. And he's like he's seen the ultimate inaccessibility of the object, so he can't return back to that fantasy. So he's going to then tumble into being Fred again.
Mm-hmm. So she brought him to the superego. He's Fred again. He gets dressed up in Pete's clothes, which look kind of like Fred's clothes anyway. And then he goes up the stairs. He sees the mystery man. He says, "Where's Alice?" The mystery man says, "Her name is Renee. If you thought she was Alice, she's lying." And then he says, "And your name? What's your name?" And then he chases Fred back into his car with a video camera. And that's the last moment in the film where it seems like the mystery man and Fred are antagonistic. It seems like from that moment onward, they're on the same team and they're both against Dick Laurent. What happens there to cause that shift?
Yeah, I think that isn't that the moment that Fred accepts, like, so in a way, I think the end of the film is about accepting the way he accepts his ideological interpolation through the figure of the superego. And once that happens, the figure of the father is no longer necessary. So he's able to kill Dick Laurent after and the fact that he keeps saying, "What's your name?" is, I think, important, because that's your symbolic identifier, right? Your acceptance, whatever you want to call it, like acceptance of lack, acceptance of castration. Like he goes through that point then, and once you do that, he's no longer threatening, so he can do away with the figure of the father, and that's what happens at the end of the film.
That's interesting. Also, another thing that the mystery man says is, her name is Renee. If she told you her name was Alice, she's lying.
Yeah.
Is Alice Renee, or is she not Renee? What do you think?
No, I think Alice is Renee, but I think that I think we get the duplicity of superego, right? Like superego forces him into the fantasy and then upbraids him for fantasizing. So I think that's, like, to say her name is Renee is to say, look, that fantasy, you can't retreat into that fantasy.
Interesting. So then after he drives off, he goes to the Lost Highway Hotel. And this, again, I'm never quite sure, is this the Pete world or the Fred world, or something in between, like the porn world?
Yeah.
But now Renee's back. She's having sex with Dick Laurent. Fred is listening to them next door. After Renee drives away, Fred beats up Dick Laurent quite easily. He's not afraid of him anymore.
Right.
Takes him in his car, takes him out to the desert. Dick Laurent jumps out of the car, tries to kill Fred, and then it's the mystery man who gives him a knife and helps him do away with Dick Laurent. And then while Dick Laurent is dying with blood around his neck, Dick Laurent says, "What do you guys want?" And then the mystery man shows him a portable TV set of images of what looks like, again, porn world. We're watching Renee and Dick Laurent kissing each other in Andy's house. And they're watching these porn films of kind of goth rock stars from the 90s getting murdered and murdering women, intercut with lesbian scenes. And then when it's over, Dick Laurent says, "You and me, mister, we can really out-ugly them some bitches, can't we?"
Yeah.
So in your mind, does that mean that in some way, in the past at least, the mystery man and Dick Laurent were together in like a porn business? What's going on there?
No, I think that's right. And I think just theoretically, what I would say is that it shows this way in which there are allegiances between this obscene father and superego, right? Like they're in a certain way, they're allied, but then this is about when Fred adopts his proper symbolic identity, he kills off that one part, and he's just left with the superego. But what the film is showing is we're caught in a repetition of this. That's why the end of the film is actually the same as the beginning of the film.
Interesting. So why do you think is Dick Laurent's kind of pornography career and what he's showing to people in Andy's house, what Renee is getting off to, is stag films mixed with porn intercut together? What's the point of intercutting those two things together like that?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think that I think Lynch is trying to show these different versions of some obscene enjoyment, right? And so the intercutting is just, to me, is just trying to show the different varieties that this enjoyment takes. I don't know that I would read anything more into that.
It's interesting because when I first saw that scene, I remember thinking, that scene makes me feel the way that I felt when I saw porn for the first time at age 11.
Oh.
Because on the one hand, I found it erotic, and on the other hand, I found it repulsive and terrifying at the same time. Because I didn't know what it was like to have sexual feelings yet, or to see sex.
Right.
And the combination of those two things seemed like he totally encapsulated that in the way
that sounds great.
Cut those scenes together.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So there seems to be a thing in Lost Highway about the male gaze is terrifying for the male. It's not just enjoying. It's not just filled with enjoyment and pleasure. It's a kind of, it's a terror. and it's a joy at the terror. And it makes one
Yeah,
think,
I think that's right. I mean, I think, like Lacan's notion of gaze, which got really misunderstood by film theory, is that it's an object out in the visual field that embodies your own point in which you're desiring. And so it actually is about how you're captured by what you're looking at, right? Like you're not just distant from what you're looking at. And I think all of Lynch's films really are about how can I make a film that captures the desire of the spectator and forces the spectator to confront the way in which what they're seeing is structured around their desire. So they can't have this, I think we watch a lot of films with a distance saying like, oh, I would never do those things. I disapprove of that. Like I watch a horror film, of course I would never kill anyone. But what Lynch is trying to do is to say, wait a minute, you're drawn to this film. So if you're drawn to it, it must be because your desire is out in there. So he's trying to capture the desire of the spectator within the visual field. So I think that idea of gaze suggests what you're talking about, right? Like you're not watching from a safe distance. Instead, you're involved and you're in danger, threatened by the gaze.
Yeah, it's totally different to say the lesbian scene in Mulholland Drive, where that scene is very sensuous and it feels very safe looking at that as a male. Whereas the depictions of porn in Lost Highway seem very threatening to the male gazer.
Right. Although I don't necessarily totally agree about Mulholland. Like I feel like that scene is threatening because you don't like the you don't really, I mean, the enjoyment seems really, really palpable, right? And so I think that there's something kind of, I don't know, threatening.
Well, it seems like even though it seems like it's a lesbian scene that could get off the male audience, it seems like a woman-friendly lesbian scene.
No,
Well,
absolutely. Right. I agree with that. And I think, right, it could have been shot by a woman director, I think, for sure. And I know I have a lot of lesbian friends that love that like the film and love that scene. So I think that's right. And I don't think that I don't think the male spectator feels excluded from it. I would just say that that watching an intense sex scene is disturbing, right? Like it's disturbing, and it just for the intensity of it. Like they seem like they're really in love, and I think you feel like you're kind of intruding in that. And
that's interesting. I suppose in a way, and maybe we all have different phenomenologies when it comes to how we view.
Yeah.
But for me, I feel more comfortable watching a scene, I suppose, morally, if I feel like the majority of what the two people are doing in the scene is trying to please each other.
Oh yeah.
When I feel like the majority of what the people on screen are trying to do is please me, it's a bit creepier.
Yeah, I get that. I think that's a good ethical response. I agree.
I don't know if it's ethical. It's just maybe a psychological response.
No, but I think there's a kind of ethics of spectatorship that you're talking about.
But in Lost Highway, I suppose how this relates is all the porn clips in Lost Highway seem like they're there to get off the male viewer. And then because of that, they get progressively more and more disturbing and eventually involve murder in the porn scenes.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
So anyway, at the end of Lost Highway, we're back in Andy's house. Then we get the integration of the two detectives from World 1, World of Desire. Then we get the two fantasy detectives, both together in the same room, both looking at the Alice and Renee photograph. You think there's going to be some sort of explanation that's going to tie the two of them together, and you're going to figure out how these worlds interact.
Right.
And all they say is there's no such thing as bad coincidence.
Right.
So what do you think that scene is about?
Well, I just think it's about the fecklessness of the cops, right? Like they can't, like you think they're gonna, I think in a typical film, the cops would provide this explanation at the end that would straighten everything out for the viewer. And Lynch just is not gonna, he's gonna, like those traditional authorities just don't have the answer in the Lynch universe. So, I mean, what they say is just absurd, right? It doesn't make any sense of that photograph and doesn't help you understand what's going on.
The way that I interpret it is like they actually know the secret. That's what he means by there's no such thing as a bad coincidence. Like you feel like at any moment he's going to say, this is what happened. But Lynch cuts away before you get the explanation.
Oh, great. I like that. That's nice. Yeah.
So then the final sequence, we have Fred going to his intercom. As Fred, he speaks into the intercom, Dick Laurent is dead. So somehow he's back into the beginning of the temporal sequence of events that starts the film. Somehow he time traveled. And then the two cops see him, they chase him down the lost highway, and then he transforms again and the film ends. What's interesting to me about that scene is I don't understand why he tells himself Dick Laurent is dead. What's the purpose of him knowing that, even like without knowing what it means?
Well, okay. So if you say this obscene father is dead, then you know, then, I mean, the idea, I think, is he thinks he can free himself from this obsession that someone is out there enjoying Renee in a way that he can't. So it's interesting that the very thing that he thought might free himself is the thing that actually entraps him in the problem in the first place. So I think what Lynch is getting at is the real, in a certain way, the real uselessness of knowledge in freeing ourselves psychically from certain fantasy problems or desiring problems.
Interesting. That's interesting. One other interesting analysis of the film that I wanted to ask you about is some people have interpreted it backwards. I'm curious what you think about this, where it's actually a film about Pete. He falls in love with Alice. He gets in trouble with Dick Laurent. He kills some people. He feels like his life is out of control. He starts hallucinating, and then he imagines he's Fred. And that's actually the fantasy structure of the film. What would you say to that reading of it?
Well, that's interesting. I think that's not crazy. I guess I would just say that the problem to me is the distribution of knowledge again. Like, I think that the film, like, why would, I guess, that's my problem with it. Like, I think that in the Fred scenes, we don't have the knowledge that we have in the Peter Dayton scenes. So it strikes me as it's tough to sustain that notion that one is a fantasy filling in. Like, if you look at Mulholland Drive, right, we get all kinds of knowledge about things in the fantasy sequence that we don't, that things are kind of unknown in the second part of the film. But so Mulholland Drive has more of this, the structure that you're talking about, the way people interpret Lost Highway. But I guess just for me, that would be the decisive thing, is the way the knowledge and the mise en scène, the way that the way that it looks, I think, suggest, the one certainly suggests more of a fantasy world to me than the other.
Okay, that's interesting.
But I don't think it's crazy. I mean, maybe that's right.
So the way that in that interpretation, the reason why the LA world would look so desire-based and moody and creepy is it would give sort of Pete an excuse.
Right. No, I get it. Yeah.
I'm being chased by demons. It wasn't
right. Sure.
What's also interesting about Lost Highway, which differentiates it in my mind from Eraserhead and Mulholland Drive, is as weird as the other two films are, they feel like they're making statements about life, about human beings. Lost Highway, as much as I love it, it feels like it's making a statement about films more than it is about life. What do you think it's saying about life, if anything?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Like, the other two films are more of like life statements. I guess what I would say is it's really a film about how we need to look at the structure of our fantasy and encounter the trauma that's inherent in our fantasy life. Although I think Mulholland maybe does it better, right? Like, I think the same idea is apparent in Mulholland. I think Lynch was, in a way, I think you could say, like, he was working to it in Lost Highway, and then in Mulholland he really gets to the idea that he was working out in Lost Highway. But I think that's the idea that we can find this traumatic thing within our fantasy, and then if we encounter that, we can in some way try to free ourselves from our our captivity within our certain whatever identity that we're stuck in.
Interesting. Yeah. maybe the way of thinking about it is Mulholland Drive and Eraserhead use fantasy and desire as a way of commenting on things about life, whereas Lost Highway is about fantasy itself, or fantasy
Right.
and desire. It's about how we need to confront fantasy and desire.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think because the whole film is about that confrontation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. I absolutely love it. And that leads us to the next film that we're going to talk about, which is what you might consider like a sister piece or a spiritual sequel or prequel, depending on how you look at it, Mulholland Drive. Now, Mulholland Drive is really interesting because you might think initially, oh, this is a feminist film, because unlike Lost Highway, it's about female subjectivity.
Mhm.
But you could also critique it on that very grounds because it's about lesbians, meaning it's about trying to chase female desire and being upset when you don't get it. So it's kind of replaying the heteronormative male struggle, but putting it in two women. What do you think about that critique of it?
No, I don't think that's right. I think it's a genuine exploration of a lesbian fantasy. Like I don't think that it's, and I think his point is that the structure of fantasy isn't, it's that structure is kind of the same, right? Like it doesn't matter who's doing the fantasizing. So I think he wants to say that, and I guess I can see why you say this may be heteronormative, but his I think he wants to say that there's no like grand difference between between fantasy structures, right? Like fantasy is there's a basic structure to fantasy.
Interesting. So could you, by the same logic, do a gay story about chasing desire that would be exactly the same?
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So Mulholland Drive starts off with a very interesting kind of 1950s dance sequence and juxtaposed against an image of Naomi Watts as Betty, with this elderly couple kind of holding her as she's winning this award, it looks like, having won this dance contest. Then we go to an image of a pillow. Someone seems to be breathing their last breath. And we go to Mulholland Drive itself, and we see this beautiful actress called Rita, who's going to get killed, but then she's rescued by these teenagers who look like they might have come from the very dance sequence that we saw previously. And then she winds up having her life saved, having amnesia. She's walking around LA, not knowing who she is. And she winds up just kind of walking into this woman's house she doesn't know, because she needs some place to stay until she remembers who she is.
Right.
And that's what gets our plot started. So in this early set of sequences where we see the Rita character and that she's walking around in Hollywood, do you think here we're in the same sort of Pete world that we were in Lost Highway, of kind of fantasy Hollywood, or is this desire to you?
No, I think this is fantasy Hollywood, right? Like I think it's funny because this film is misleading. Like you think that this is like Rita's the main character, and it's going to be an exploration of her stuck in this world of desire where she doesn't know anything. But it turns out that that is all part of really Diane's fantasy structure. So it's interesting how it leads you down that one direction, but then later on you're going to say like, oh no, it's Betty / Diane who's really at the center of the fantasizing.
So we've got unlike Lost Highway, in some ways this is more like Twin Peaks, because there's a couple of plots happening at the same time in the first half of the film. So the first plot is we have Betty, who's this beautiful young actress who's going to stay with her aunt, who winds up finding Rita and then sort of looking after her, protecting her, helping her find out who she was, being her sort of a savior in a way.
Right.
And then on top of that, we see corrupt Hollywood plots. We see a director who can't have control over his own film because of the mafia. We see corrupt, potentially supernatural figures making odd phone calls.
Right.
We see a dream sequence where a therapist is taking a man behind a Winkies to look at some sort of a monster that gives him a panic attack that the therapist can't see. And what's interesting about this plot is you think, okay, you're going to find out some connection between this monster and this therapist and the rest of the story, but you don't. It's almost like a dangling thread. What do you think is this therapist story about?
Well, I mean, I think what happened was obviously he was going to be a television series and it got turned into a film. So I'm not sure that we would have, I think Lynch just liked that and didn't want to take it out. But I think for him, it's about, it's just another instance where there's this, not like the Winkies, this nice fantasy world that everything seems perfect. But then behind it, you have this horrible monster figure, right? So that's, again, I think that's a perfectly Lynchian moment, and it doesn't it fits thematically in with the rest of the film. I don't think it fits narratively in with the rest of the film, right? Like it's in there as this scene to show the way in which you go into the fantasy. That's how you discover this traumatic part of your being that you've otherwise repressed.
Interesting. So this monster appears in the beginning of the film, but also in the end when we've left the fantasy and gone back into the desire. And it seems like the monster is sort of controlling the dynamics of the world with some sort of a box that appears at numerous points throughout the film that we at least get an insinuation that the monster is controlling at the end. How do you think the monster is controlling the events of the film?
Well, I think it's this repressed kernel of Diane Betty's psyche that can't, and actually of the entire social, everyone that exists within the social order, right? Like there's this monstrous part of us that then is repressed and that is always threatening to reemerge. And I think that's what we're seeing in the Winky scene. And then I think there's the constant threat of that reemerging throughout.
Interesting. Is that monster a different variation on the Mystery Man? Is it a superego?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think, because I think it's the cowboy figure that's more the superego in Mulholland Drive and not the monster. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that.
Okay, so we encounter the cowboy figure, who you think is a superego, through the Adam Kesher plotline. Adam Kesher is the director who's going to be doing this film. I think it's the Sylvia North story, it's called, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And presumably Betty's going to star in it if he sees her. Everything seems to be leading towards him discovering this wonderful actress, but the mafia and the corrupt Hollywood people are preventing that. And one of the ways they prevent that is that after he has a horrendously awful experience with the mafia, he goes a bit nuts. He bangs up their car. He's scared. He goes in a hotel somewhere, motel rather, and then he gets called by his assistant who tells him, this cowboy wants to see you, after he's had also a horrendous encounter being beat up by Billy Ray Cyrus, who's having sex with his wife. Right. So he's just like a trodden upon, like studio hired doormat for Hollywood. If he's good, whether he's good or not, it seems like he is totally controlled by Hollywood. Right. He's their bitch, basically. Right. And then he goes to see the cowboy. Now, what I'm curious about is, what relationship do you think the cowboy has to the rest of Hollywood? Why is he sent to see that person in particular?
Yeah, I think that it's about the way in which Hollywood puts this superegoic pressure on the director, right? Like, I think Mulholland Drive to me is a real statement of love of Hollywood and about the power of cinema and praise of that. But then it's also critical of the way in which there's a giving in about that power, and I think the cowboy represents the figure of that force that puts, that doesn't give the director final cut of his films, that takes Dune away from him or whatever. Mm-hmm.
Do you ever worry that actually the film is saying the opposite of that? Because in the reality, it turns out that the director was really powerful and a bit of a jerk. And it's the fantasy that he's downtrodden that Diane is relying on to sort of rewrite history and make her life better.
How is he powerful in the? Oh, because he's really a celebrated. Yeah. That's probably true. I think you're right, actually. Yeah. I think that's right. Sorry, it's been a little longer since I've seen Mulholland Drive, but yeah.
One of the things that I was thinking about watching it the other day, and I'm curious what you think of this. When I saw it originally in 2001, I very much thought that no matter how surreal this movie was, this was a Hollywood sucks movie. This was a variation on Sunset Boulevard. And when I watched it this time, I kind of thought, no, this is about someone who was really messed up, not talented, did not treat other people well, lost the love of their life, probably for good reason, and then became homicidal. And then they had to rely on a Hollywood sucks fantasy to
I think
rewrite.
that's absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think that's why I said I think it's a real celebration. I don't think Lynch is ever the kind of figure that's driven by resentment about Hollywood. Like, I just don't think that drives him. I think he's able to like take these setbacks, like he lost funding for Mulholland. They made him solve Laura Palmer's murder too early. All these things, and I think he kind of lets it just roll off his back. So yeah, I do not think it's a Hollywood sucks fantasy.
Yeah. And speaking of one of the things that the film seems to be kind of promoting about Hollywood, and something it seems to be seeing as wonderful, is there's something in Betty where in the first few scenes when she's looking after Rita, she seems like a kind of sitcom character from the 1950s almost. You almost kind of, you like her, but you're laughing at her, and she's kind of childish moments. You know, she breaks an entering and does all these kind of things that are a bit Audrey Horne-like, actually.
Yeah.
But then there's a scene where she performs as an actress in front of a crowd of people who love what she's doing. And I find that scene really fascinating because people always talk about how wonderful Naomi Watts was in that scene and how she turned the scene into a seduction scene and how that was brilliant. But what I've always thought watching that scene was, it sounded to me like they were playing a scene about a young woman or young girl who was being sexually abused by somebody in a position of power. And then that same young person deciding to suddenly be seductive like a woman. So she's playing like a child suddenly behaving sexual. And that's really creepy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. That's a really good point. And I think one of the things that makes that scene so disturbing is the contrast between the way she plays it with Rita and then the way she plays it with, I think his name is Chad, right? The actual actor. So I think that, that contrast really, it becomes very creepy, I think.
So she's kind of applauded and seen as this great actress for playing a sexualized child when it's unexpected, when she's supposed to be playing a vulnerable child.
Right, right. Well, it also shows the way that we don't have any, like the script can say one thing and the performance can turn it into exactly the opposite, right? Like she read the script one way the first time and then just completely the opposite the second time.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the lines were exactly the same.
Yeah, but it also shows something about Betty's character, which is interesting. It shows on the one hand, she's Diane, and that this is sort of how Diane would have liked to have done a scene.
Right.
But it shows that there's some sort of like creativity and darkness. It shows that there's something in Diane, which is maybe a bit like David Lynch. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, I think it does attest to Diane's ability to get in touch with the dark creativity, for sure.
And in that way, it's almost like that's the one scene that lets you know Diane wasn't completely a failure at everything in life.
Right.
There was at least one thing she was good at. She was creative in this one respect.
Right. Right. No, I think that's right.
So then we see the famous sequence where Adam has to turn Betty down for the role because of the mafia people. Then Betty and Rita are going on further adventures to try and figure out who Rita is. We see the corpse who is probably Diane. Why do you think at this point in the story, the corpse is turning up right after Diane is rejected from her big role?
Yeah, I think that isn't the fantasy collapsing at this point. And I think it's interesting. I think Lynch shoots that when they're leaving the apartment where after they see the corpse, he like, what that's called. I remember, I've forgotten what it's called.
Layering.
Yeah, that's right. And so he films that in a way to show that we're kind of losing touch with the fantasy at that point.
Okay. So then they go back home. For a reason I don't understand, they decide to have sort of similar blonde haircuts to disguise themselves, although I don't know what exactly to disguise themselves from or how that's going to work.
No, I don't know either.
and then they have sex. And it's a very interesting, like we've talked about earlier, it's like the opposite of a Lost Highway lesbian sex scene, because it feels like they're pleasuring each other
Correct.
more than they are pleasuring the audience. And they're also, Betty especially, is saying something really, really important, which is maybe the key to the film, and that's I'm in love with you.
Right.
And this seems to me like the first moment where the fantasy is beginning to unravel because of love. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we get the real vulnerability that is involved with love, right? Like you make yourself totally vulnerable to the other person. And that's what she did as Diane, right? And then she was destroyed by that.
Do you think there's something about love that makes us be willing to destroy fantasies for it?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, love cuts through a fantasy.
So there's some kind of connection between love and truth that the film is commenting on here.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So after she falls in love with, or realizes she's always loved Rita for maybe a reason she can't understand, Rita says, we have to go somewhere. We have to go to this place called Club Silencio.
Yeah.
So they go at what looks like 3 a.m. They take a cab to this club, and Laura Palmer's there, among other people. Right. And they watch this performance, which is a very quintessentially Lynchian performance, where there's a man on stage saying that every word he is speaking, he's not actually speaking because it's all been recorded on a tape. Right. Trumpet player comes out, plays a bit, turns out he's not really playing. Then there's this beautiful sequence where a woman comes out and sings Roy Orbison's Crying in Spanish. Both of them are in tears. And then the box—
It's Rebecca Del Rio is the singer.
Rebecca Del Rio. And then the box they were playing with, the blue box that initially had to do with money and a key, that crops up again. And they both decide, we both have to go home and open this box intuitively. What I'm curious about is, what do you think Club Silencio did to get both of them to willingly leave the fantasy like that?
Yeah, I think it's because the Il n'y a pas d'orchestre, no hay banda, right? Like the guy who's saying this is all on tape that you mentioned, the problem is that the falseness of the fantasy structure became apparent to them. And then when they found themselves totally moved, as I was as a spectator, by Rebecca Del Rio's version of Crying. And then you find out that the song goes on when she collapses, right? So even the most intense experience is faked within the fantasy structure. And then I think that's what causes they can no longer sustain that fantasy world at that point.
There's something about that scene which I find very moving. Probably it's the most moving thing emotionally in a Lynch movie.
Probably.
It's this idea that you can have everything that you want with another person, and you can destroy absolutely all of that and go into hell. And the one thing that would make you do that was wanting to know what love was like in reality. It's like you can have the perfect fantasy where you get Rita, you're her caregiver, she loves you, you love her back, the sex is great, everything's wonderful, you're a great actress, but you will obliterate all of that and go into hell because you want to know what loving her was really like.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point, Greg.
So I'm curious, why does love have this power where we will go into hell for it if it means having real love as opposed to the love of fantasy? Yeah,
because I think, look, Alain Badiou calls love an event, right? Like, and I think that's right. Like, it's a real disruption of our being. So when you say go through hell for it, I mean, that kind of is what love is. It's kind of going through hell. And I think that, but it's also the most satisfying. It trumps probably all other human experiences. So I think that's why. I mean, it's this touching of the beyond, right? It's like almost like you touch the sky, you touch the divine when you're feeling in love. So I think that's why there's this willingness to do anything.
Interesting. So would you say that when, for instance, a couple falls in love and they decide to stay with each other and have a family and get married, is what's going on is a fantasy is motivating two people to commit to decades of desire rather than fantasy?
No, I don't think so. Like I think they can be moved by love to commit to each other. I don't think that's necessarily phantasmatic at all. Like I think there's real love experiences that don't just fade away. Like I think that they can stay.
So you wouldn't say that the early part of a relationship is the fantasy bit?
No, I would. Well, yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, like you always approach the other through a fantasy. That's true. But then love shatters the fantasy, and then I think the desire to stay together can just be a desire to continue the love relationship. Like I don't think it's trying to set up return to desire or nothing like that.
Interesting. So we, in the film Return to Desire, Betty opens the box, Rita goes off screen. We're back into the world where the cowboy tells Betty, who is now Diane, time to wake up.
Time to wake up, little girl, right?
And then she is awakened to a kind of disjointed world where it seems like she's getting memory fragments.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's memory fragments of an objective world rather than memory fragments of like a Fred Madison type desire world. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we have much more of a sense of what the world is really like in this film than in Lost Highway. Yeah.
And although some things appear like probably they're time jumps or maybe they didn't happen, like the sex scenes going in and out and then fighting and having sex and all those juxtapositions and light and dark, it does seem like in this last part of the film, we get a sense that Diane was probably not the best actress and probably somebody who gave people good reasons to not want to be in relationships with her. Would you say that?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
But her fantasy was Hollywood is corrupt and they don't, let the talent rise to the top.
Right.
What's interesting about that is a lot of people might see that and say, oh, this is a reactionary film because it looks like it begins with a structural critique of Hollywood. And then it's saying, no, it's the individual failing to live up to the standards of the structures. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that's an interesting critique. I guess my point would be that I don't think Lynch, I mean, clearly he's not invested in the Hollywood system because he makes films that don't fit in it. But I think he sees the potential there for exploring the world of fantasy, and that there's something valuable in that. And I don't think that it's so much a criticism of, I guess I don't read it so much as a criticism of Diane as a praise for the potential of what Hollywood could do, even though it's gone awry in ways that I think Lynch would be certain to avow. But I think I guess I don't read it so much as a like this individualist, like you're saying, like kind of individualist film. Yeah.
Interesting. So two of the recurring figures that seem demonic in the film are the monster behind the Winkies and the old couple, who initially seems to be wishing Betty well at the beginning of the film in her fantasy. And at the end, they seem to be terrorizing her until she kills herself,
right?
Maybe as a way of atoning for the fact that she's just put a hit on her ex-girlfriend.
Yeah.
What do you think this couple represents? Are they something like a superego?
Yeah, I think, they're kind of like that. I think they're that would fit. I mean, if they're what drive her to suicide, it would fit that they were super egoic. I guess for me, they were these figures of to me, they were the figures of normalcy, right? Like they seem like they're perfectly normal. And then there's this pressure hidden within the normal that's really destructive and unrelenting. And I think that's, I don't know. So I don't know, but I think your point about them as superegoic probably makes sense. The way I would think about them.
Interesting. And so at the end of the film, we cut to images of Betty smiling layered against Hollywood stars. And then we go back to Club Silencio. We see a woman who's been static there before, but who didn't say anything during the sequence. And she says silencio, and we fade to black. What do you think is the importance of the phrase silencio that keeps coming up throughout the film and ends the film?
Yeah, I think I say this in the book. I think the point is for Lynch that we go through speaking, fantasy, film to get to this point of silence, right? And so the silencio is for him this point where we encounter like the monster behind Winkies, which is speechless, right? And or we encounter our own, the trauma that structures our own subjectivity, and then it's through fantasy that we get to this point of silence where, you know, if you think about it, if we're born into a symbolic structure that of signification of words, then silence represents the limit of that structure, right? Like the point that can't be incorporated into it. And so I think that's what Lynch is getting us to try to encounter, that traumatic limit of our social structure, of our subjectivity, etc.
What's interesting about that film in comparison to, say, Lost Highway is it seems like the superegoic forces in Lost Highway want Fred to survive and keep running, whereas the superegoic forces in Mulholland Drive want Diane to die and then experience silence maybe as a form of peace. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's true. What if those are the same, right? Like what if like that you're caught up in the repetition is also a way of like dying and being caught up in the repetition are kind of our two alternatives. Like we're just stuck between these two options. So one isn't really that much different than the other, right? So I think that, but I mean, I take your point that they are clearly, they are clear alternatives. And I guess that it's tempting to read them as one is a male version of subjectivity and one is a female version of subjectivity, right? I don't know that I want to do that, but I think it's, despite based on what you're saying, I think that's tempting. And that the male version is structured around this constant repetition, and the female version is structured around this symbolic suicidal act, right?
Well, also what's interesting is it seems like Diane has a much stronger mind than Fred, because her fantasy really precisely changes absolutely everything she wanted to change.
Right.
And her break away from fantasy and the desire ends with her not running away, but her choosing to end her own life.
Right.
So she's really strong-minded in ways that Fred is not.
Right. I think, right. If either character, I think she would be the example of a more ethical character than Fred. I think that's right to say.
Interesting. How is she more ethical, you think?
Well, just in the way that you just said, right? She doesn't run away. She doesn't keep running away, but like confronts the horror herself at the end.
Interesting. So do you think there's a sense in which she ought to have committed suicide rather than like gone to jail?
The jail for putting the hit out on Rita, yeah.
Was that her only way to atone, let's say?
I think that's the idea of the film. Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting. So what do you think is the difference between Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive in terms of how it's getting us to understand our relationship to fantasy?
Well, I think just like you've been saying, I think the commitment to fantasy in Mulholland is much more thoroughgoing, right? Like it's much more like we're really going to discover something about ourselves in fantasy rather than fleeing from something about ourselves, which I think in Lost Highway, there's much more theoretical ambivalence about fantasy. There's much more of a sense that you're fleeing from some existential problem into fantasy, and maybe that's a problem. But in Mulholland, it's through the flight into fantasy that you really confront a certain existential problem. So I think that would be what I would say, that the investment in fantasy is much more thoroughgoing in Mulholland than in Lost Highway. And so in that sense, I think Mulholland represents a kind of sweet spot in Lynch's work, because in Inland Empire, I think it goes way too far into the fantasy world, and I think that causes that film to be really a failure. Like I think it's the only Lynch failure, really.
Yeah, I
And
don't really like it either. Apart from the fact that I find it terrifying. That's about the only thing I like about it.
Yeah, but I think it pushes even too far into that fantasy world.
Interesting. So, do you think that there is, unlike Lost Highway, a kind of a political take home from Mulholland Drive that's much more specific?
Yeah, I think that's right. Like explore, confront your fantasy. Like confront your fantasy and find there this traumatic repressed and confront it. And I think it's much less ambivalent about fantasy than Lost Highway is.
That's interesting. So in a way, that film, I think, is a little bit, I don't want to say more commercial, but it's a bit easier for like a first-time Lynch fan to get into than Lost Highway would be.
Yeah.
The next film we're going to talk about is harder than Lost Highway, probably for a first-time film goer to get into David Lynch.
Yes.
And that is my favorite David Lynch film, Eraserhead.
Yeah.
So before we start this, I wanted to ask you, when did you first see this film?
I had seen, how much have I seen? I had probably seen most of Lynch before I had seen this. So I saw it probably after I saw Lost Highway. So like 98, 99, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was living in Los Angeles. No, I was in Los Angeles, so it's earlier. So it's like 97, but yeah, something like that.
Yeah. In a way, you could see it as like prototypical David Lynch film, or the ultimate David Lynch film, maybe.
Yeah.
But one thing that I find really fascinating about it, apart from the fact that this is the hardest one for me to understand, is it feels like it's a David Lynch film without being a David Lynch film, in the sense that like all the things that I would associate with him aren't there apart from the weirdness. So there's no jazzy noir soundtrack. There's no women in trouble. There's no doppelgangers. There's no criminals in the suburbs. There's no sadomasochism. There's no obviously supernatural things where we know definitively that something supernatural is going on.
Yeah.
It's almost like another filmmaker could have made it, but not quite, because it's totally David Lynch.
Right. I think it's more like a European art film. It's not, I think it's less like the kind of film, or a surreal, like an old French surrealist film. Like you could imagine it's like the sequel to Chien Andalou, right? Or something like that. Like so it has that, but I guess it's the film where I decided to write the book on Lynch for the first time. So I was in I have terrible insomnia. I couldn't sleep. And so I thought, I'll put on Eraserhead because it's so boring.
Yeah.
I'll fall asleep. And then I got this idea for writing on Eraserhead. Then I'm like, well, God, I probably got to write a whole book on Lynch at some point. So it was really decisive in that way for me.
Yeah. The other thing about the film, which is so unique in Lynch's canon, is it seems like it's the only film of his which is surreal, which is not channeling the 50s. It seems like it's channeling like the 30s. Do you get that impression watching it?
No, absolutely right, Greg. I think that's perfectly right. I also think it's the one that's most critical of capitalism, right? Like it really is, in a way that his other films are kind of like, just like you're saying about Mulholland, like there's no like real critique of the film industry. If anything, it's the opposite. And so, but in Eraserhead, there's a definite critique of the relationship between capitalist production and our own castration, right? Like that's the whole idea of the film, the whole notion of the Eraserhead, when the eraser pops the guy's head off, right? Like that, it seems like it's really, and the way they turn up the gears all the time, right? Like it's a little like, there's something like Modern Times is in there, I think. So it really has a much more of a critique of capital, I think, than any of the other ones.
That's a really good observation. I thought about Charlie Chaplin when I saw that film too in modern times. But the thing about the politics of Eraserhead is it seems, first of all, like there are politics.
Yeah.
Whereas in the other movies, it's like, well, there might be politics, but they're going to be buried underneath this or that meaning.
Mhm.
Whereas this film seems like it's almost like a punk rock politics film in a surreal done fashion.
Yeah.
And the reason it feels like it's political in the way that the other films are harder to decipher that way is it feels like Henry is a product of his environment. Really, really
Right.
a product of that environment.
Yeah,
You
I
get
think
that
that's
from
right.
watching it.
Yeah, that seems right to me.
Because it seems like this film takes place, if it takes place anywhere at all, in some kind of a low economic growth capitalist society. You could read it maybe as like East Germany, maybe, but there's no references to the state in it. So I don't.
Yeah, I don't think that's right.
It seems like it's it's like the opposite of Blade Runner. If Blade Runner is a dystopian, high economic growth capitalist future, this is like a low economic growth capitalist future. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, absolutely right. Like you could definitely read it as a science fiction film, as a depiction of the future.
Yeah, and that's how I really want to read it. I really want to see it as science fiction-y, but the way that it's structured keeps me from reading it as anything. And I'll go into it in a bit. So why that is in a bit. So
Yeah.
The first sequence that we see in Eraserhead is we see Henry Spencer's head floating out in space.
Right.
And then we see behind him is what looks like an asteroid. There's a man inside the asteroid in what looks like a train, some sort of a dilapidated like 1930s train. We hear the sounds of a train, and this man who has burns all over him is ejecting with levers what look like spermatozoa out of Henry's head.
Yeah.
And then the spermatozoa splash into water. We go into the water with the camera. Then from inside the darkness, we see this bright light with a hole around it, which looks a bit like the opening of a vagina with hair on it. We go into that hole, and then we see Henry in this what could be science fiction, low growth, capitalist future. The question that the film asks is, or it makes us ask, is what is the relationship between that opening sequence and Henry's world? Was that a dream? Is that the cause of the world? What is the relationship between that man and the levers and Henry's world? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we're supposed to think like with Chaplin, like he's producing this world, right? Like it's a world produced by some kind of capitalist industrialist system of productivity. I think that's right.
Okay, so but is that opening sequence Henry's dream, or is that a literal magical god of some sort who created the Henry world? How does it work?
Well, I think it's his way of figuring the creation of it, but I don't think I think we're supposed to think in Lynch, right, that the dream has a kind of objective reality to it, right? Like it's not just so it's indecipherable, right? You can't say, oh, this is just happening within the psyche and this is happening without. It's almost like what happened, the structure of the dream gives him access to what formed the world, even though it's in a highly allegorical way, right? Like it's not literal.
Okay, so is this man in the asteroid with the levers, is this the superego figure? Is this the mystery man of Eraserhead? What do you think?
I don't think so. I guess I didn't read a superego figure in Eraserhead, but maybe there is. Maybe you're right. No, I don't know.
Okay, so we go into the Eraserhead world, and we see Henry walking home in this horrifically depressing environment, wherever it is, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating about it, and which makes this again different from all the other David Lynch movies, is you never get a sense of like there's reality and then there's bizarre things intruding in. It seems like we're starting from a completely alien, weird world to begin with. There's never any normal that the surrealism breaks into.
Right.
Do you get that impression from it?
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. And the way in which we're constantly, we're just submerged into this totally barren world. I think that's the key thing, right? Like it's a world of loss. And I think that to me, the beginning part is suggestive of that, right? Like like the industrial capitalist machine subjects him to this loss, and then he's thrust in this world where he can't get his bearings, nothing moves quickly, right? Like he gets in the elevator, and the elevator takes a long time for the doors to close, takes too long to go up. So everything works too slowly, everyone responds too slowly. So there's this real sense of like your total alienation within that world, I think. So I guess to me, it's a real exploration of the alienating nature of capitalist society.
And one of the ways that it does that, maybe the key political element in the film, to me at least, is Henry's on vacation. So this is an explanation of what the world is like when you don't have to work in it, when you live in a world which is totally devoted to work and nothing else.
Yeah. No, that's great. It's a great point.
So, and it really does look like an empty version of Blade Runner in a way. I see those two films as very connected visually in a weird way. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But it's a really empty, dark, 1930s-ish, low-growth capitalist society where everybody behaves very oddly. It's a world of like desire, very much in the Fred Madison,
very much so,
more extreme.
Yeah. Right.
So Henry goes to his apartment, which has the zigzag floor like the Black Lodge. He goes to his door, and then he hears from across the hallway, the beautiful girl across the hallway, who makes her first appearance, and for a very long time tells him there's a girl on the payphone who wanted to have you call her back. It's your girlfriend Mary. She's at her parents and she wants to meet you for dinner. And then Henry says, yeah, thank you. But what's interesting about this scene is it's really, really slow. But on the other hand, it communicates she's attracted to him. He's
Right.
attracted to her. He feels unconfident and awkward about it. But it's like that slowed by 6 times.
Yeah.
Why is it like that?
Again, I just think that's this is a world we're suffocating, not from the fantasy, but from desire, right? Like we're so far from being able to realize our desire that that's the slowness, I think, really captures that.
Okay. So then we go into Henry's room, and he puts his food down. He puts on some Fats Waller, again, suggesting that this is the 30s or somewhere about that time. He stares into his radiator. There's what look like tiny worms underneath it. He looks at a black wall outside of his window. He's got a blank expression on his face. It looks like everything is pretty miserable. And yet, as we will discover as the film goes on, this is the happiest moment in Henry's life that we see him, is sitting in this room listening to Fats Waller with no baby, with no attachments, with some sexual freedom if he chooses to explore it. This is the highlight of his life.
Right.
What do you think of this scene?
Yeah, it's a great scene. I mean, I think isn't the highlight when he fantasizes about the radiator lady? I mean, I guess I would say that's to me the highlight for him. Like when he has that idea that she comes out of the radiator. That seems to me to be the
Okay. So and in a way this is hinting at that because we see
yeah, for sure. Right.
So then we go to we see what other people are like in this world for the first time. We go to his girlfriend Mary's parents' house, and they haven't seen each other maybe for a few months, maybe for a few weeks, we don't know. But the reason Henry is there is because the mother is going to announce that Henry is now a father, even though it's premature and they're not really sure it is a baby.
Yeah.
And they have this really bizarrely comic dinner sequence,
right,
where there's a chicken that has blood coming out of it. The father is smiling in places where it's inappropriate. Mary's crying. Her mother is hitting on Henry. There's a grandmother who does absolutely nothing but sit and smoke a cigarette while her daughter uses her arms to toss salad.
Yeah.
It's like a absurd comedy in the most extreme form you could imagine.
Right.
Why do you think this scene functions this way?
Yeah, it's such a great scene. I mean, it again, it like, I think there's not one point in the scene where we can get our bearings as a spectator. And I think that, to me, that's the crucial thing, right? Like there's no point where we can orient ourselves and see what we expect to see and think like, oh, this is what a dinner usually is like. This is what it's like to cut a chicken. And things that should be alive are dead. Like the grandmother she should at least be able to toss the salad, but she's like a marionette. And then things that should be dead, like the chicken, seem alive, like it moves, right? And so I think that there's just no way to get your bearings in this world. And I think this scene really shows that. So we get a sense really of Henry's alienation from all the people around him.
So given that this scene is so bizarre and so funny in such a otherworldly fashion, how do we know that this is desire and not fantasy?
Right. I think it's just because it seems so removed from any satisfaction, right? It's so dissatisfying for Henry and for us as spectators that I think it'd be impossible to think of this as a fantasy.
So fantasy is not necessarily correlating with surrealism or reality. It's more about satisfaction.
No, that's right. That's right.
So that's interesting. So then we cut away from this dinner sequence after Henry has a nosebleed.
Right.
We actually get to see the baby. And the baby is absolutely disgusting.
Right.
You don't mind me saying?
No.
It looks neither male or female. It looks monstrous and inhuman. And it looks like if you were to open up its bandages, it could possibly die and spill all over the table.
Which it does, right? That happens. Yeah.
But it also seems like the baby isn't really a baby, because if you kill the baby, Henry dies as well, and so does the world of Eraserhead. So what is this baby exactly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that the baby isn't it the point of Henry's dissatisfaction, right? Like the thing that embodies his dissatisfaction with his existence and his world and his life. And so, but you're right, it's a kind of a symptom for him, right? Like if you destroy the symptom, you destroy Henry as well. And so it's the thing that's at once burdening him and also the thing tying him to his existence.
What's also interesting is that if you kill the baby, you kill the man and the planet's ability to have a functioning world. Right. You kill the capitalist order, but you also kill Mary. You kill the girl across the hall. You kill Mary's parents. It looks like you kill everybody, including Henry.
Right.
Why is the baby so central in the functioning of this world?
Well, I think it's just, I mean, isn't there a sense in which the baby marks reproduction itself, right? And so if there's no reproduction, then the world dies out. And so in a way, I think one of the things Lynch is exploring is how capitalism and capitalist alienation poses a threat to the very continued reproduction of society, right? I mean, it's an interesting thing about capitalism that it's the first socioeconomic order that reproduces through production rather than through excess production rather than through direct reproduction, right? So that, I think that's part of what Lynch is exploring, the way in which reproduction itself is almost repressed under capitalism.
Interesting. So you don't see the baby as a symbol of capitalist reproduction?
No, in fact, I think it's a product of it, I think, but it's in a way, it's kind of we see how endangered reproduction is and the reproduction of life is by capitalism through the figure of the baby.
Interesting. So do you think Henry knows that if he's killing the baby, he's not just killing the baby, he's killing everything?
No, I don't think he knows that. No.
Interesting. So in a way, you don't think that the decision to murder the baby is a form of suicide?
No, I don't think so. I think he's trying to I think he thinks I can get rid of my symptom and then I'll be free of it. I think we often think that, I can get rid of the symptom and be okay.
So when Mary and Henry are looking after the baby in the next sequences, we see that Henry is bringing something into his house, which looks like a little worm, and periodically taking out and playing with, while she's looking after the baby, not very happily. Later in the film, we see that this worm is going to open up, the camera's going to go inside, and we're going to be immersed into some other scene, which may be related to or not related to the world that we're in before the camera goes in the opening of this worm. What do you think this worm is? Is it related to the worm at the beginning of the film that went into the pool of water?
Yeah, I think these are like figures of enjoyment, right? Like they're little figures of enjoyment that are not permitted within this symbolic universe of this capitalist universe of the film.
Interesting. So these are kind of, they're not so much dangerous harbingers of responsibility in your view. They're not sperm. They're more like pornography?
Yeah, something like that, right? Like some possibility of some other kind of possibility that's alive in a way that the whole world is not alive.
Yeah. So he's playing with these things. And Mary eventually goes to bed with him. He tries to put his hand on Mary, like he wants to have sex. She kind of pushes him away. She starts crying. The baby's crying. You see that brick wall, there's thunder and lightning. She eventually gets fed up. She leaves after a very long attempt to get her suitcase out of the bed.
Right.
And then he's left alone with the baby while she's at her parents'. Now, what's interesting is at various points, it's not clear. Did she come back or did she stay away and he's dreaming Mary's back in his bed? Do you think Mary comes back or do you think Mary's gone?
Yeah, again, I think she does come back, but I think that again, like the difference between what's real and what's objectively real and what's psychically real it's not important so much.
Okay. Also, while he's looking after the baby on his own, it seems like there are kind of vague things happening outside of the home. People are getting beaten up, maybe there's coins on the ground. He wants to go outside of his apartment to see what's going on. He can't because the baby's crying. What do you think's going on outside of his house?
Yeah, I mean, I think isn't this the way desire functions? There seems to be life happening everywhere else except in my immediate vicinity. So that's what I would say about that.
Okay. So then he takes the baby's temperature once it stops crying, because it stopped crying, and that's actually a warning sign. The temperature is normal. Then he looks back and it's completely covered in horrendous warts that are absolutely disgusting, and he's got to sit with it. And having to sit with the sick baby seems like it's much worse for him than a healthy one. And that's when he sees the radiator lady for the first time, doing her little dance. And she's smiling. She's stomping on giant versions of sperm, and she's got burnt cheeks. So I'm curious, is she a positive for you or a negative figure in the film?
Totally positive figure. Yeah. Like she represents this fantasy escape for him from all of this drudgery. But I think she's a totally positive figure. Like I think that, again, I think this is like Lynch sees the actual world as so alienating and such a drudgery that the phantasmatic escape from it he views as positive.
Why is she burnt and disfigured like the man on the planet is?
Yeah, I don't know about that. That's a good question. I don't know if you have a theory about it. I guess my idea was just that we're seeing how even the fantasy structure bears the scars of this world, right? Like even in the fantasy, you don't totally escape from it. But I don't know. I don't have a good theory other than that.
Okay. Why do you think she's stomping on spermazoa and smiling? What's the function of that?
Well, I think she's like, this is the way where that's again this connection between those whatever those are, sperm and enjoyment, right? Like she's a figure of enjoyment for him, and that's her relation with those is part of that.
But she's killing them. Is there?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I guess you could say that she's destroying reproductivity and thus providing a way out of this, the horror of this structure. But I don't know that that's, I think she's like, isn't it that she's getting off on the sperm rather than allowing, yeah, I don't know. I don't necessarily have a good idea on that.
Well, the way that I interpreted it when I saw
Yeah,
it
tell me.
was she's saying, you know, if you want, you can kill your kid.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I see that. Yeah. Yeah.
But so anyway, we go from there to suddenly Mary's back in bed. And we're
Right.
like, we're in a different timeline. It's a different night. She come back,
Right.
we don't know. And then Mary is having sperm coming out of her. Henry's taking it out, throwing it against the wall. There's so many of them, he can't keep track of them. They're disgusting. They're flying away from his hands quite slowly, almost like alien creatures. And then he looks at the drawer we had the little tiny sperm. The drawer opens, that little tiny sperm does it like a dance. Then it opens up. We go inside that with the camera, and then it looks like we're peering down the side of another part of the asteroid. And then we go back to Henry, and now he's totally alone. Mary's gone. It's just him and the baby. And then we hear the knock on the door, and in almost complete darkness, we see the girl across the hall again. What do you think happened in that scene?
Yeah, I think, isn't this the way in which there's this, the fantasy triggers this flood of enjoyment all through his apartment, and then it ends with this figure of, he thinks, lucrative enjoyment that is across the hall. That's how I look at that.
Yeah. Now the girl across the hall is, to me, and I don't know if you feel this way. If you don't, it's fine. But she is the most fascinating character in the film. It's not the lady in the radiator for me. The reason she's so fascinating is because I hardly ever read any essay about the film in which she's mentioned very much. But she has a hell of a lot of screen time. And she seems like she's a very important key to understanding what the film is about. What do you think she represents?
Well, I just think she represents the promise of some kind of satisfaction that he doesn't get, right? Like that here it is, so close, right across the hall. She's alluring, she's unattached. There's this possibility, but I never can get it, either through lack of courage, or because I'm already with someone, or because of the stupid baby, any of these things.
I was curious what you think of this theory, that the lady in the radiator and the girl across the hall are representing two different sides of Henry's fantasy. The lady in the radiator represents suicide, death, homicide in the name of a better religious future, where you can transcend the limitations of the capitalist world and be with God. Mm-hmm. And the girl across the hall represents the fantasy of remaining in the capitalist world, being socially transgressive and getting pleasure. And those are like the two black and white women competing for him with two different fantasies. What do you think about that?
Sure. That seems okay. Yeah. I guess I wouldn't view the radiator lady so negatively. I guess I don't think, I'm not sure I see her as religious necessarily.
You don't see the religion connotated in the song "In Heaven Everything is Fine"? Yeah,
but I mean, I don't know. I guess I read heaven as more of a metaphor that she's talking about. Like I see why you're saying that, but I didn't. I see what you're saying. Like she's like a fundamentalist fantasy almost, right, for you?
Yeah, she's like, the Christian right saying, the world is so terrible. Why don't you just kill yourself and come be with God?
Yeah. I guess. I mean, it seems like she, maybe. I don't have a real refutation of that point, Greg. I just feel like seems to me like she's presented more positively than that, I guess. Like it's, there's a kind of, I don't know, innocent joy to her that I just didn't read that as fundamentalist, but I don't have a good refutation. So.
Well, I certainly agree with you that Henry loves her, that she is like the figure that he is drawn to most consistently throughout the film, and the figure that motivates him to do what he eventually does. That's certainly true. But whether she's a seductive rather than positive influence, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
But when we get back to the scene where Henry is making love with the woman across the hall, what's really fascinating about that scene is it's a really, really long seduction scene. And again, it's Henry is being seduced by this woman he's always wanted, who he's been lusting after for how many weeks, we don't know. But when she actually seduces him, he's like a child. He doesn't know what to do. It's almost like a child being seduced by an adult and almost reluctantly going along with it.
Right.
And then they wind up kissing in a pool of milk. She is beginning to see that there is a baby in the room that's crying. He's pulling her away. And then they have this really sensuous embrace where they fall into the milk and her hair is sort of floating at the top. Then it goes into pure whiteness. And it's exactly like the pure whiteness that Henry will have at the end when he embraces the woman in the radiator. So both the women across the hall and the lady in the radiator are leading him into states of pure white bliss.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you just described it correctly, right? Like that they're both this like lure into the ultimate enjoyment that is totally denied to you from this capitalist industrial world. So I think that seems exactly right to me.
What's interesting also and fascinating is there's a very immediate separation of the girl across the hall from Henry right after the sex scene. It looks like she's beginning to get a glimpse of the asteroid. And when she gets a glimpse of the asteroid, she recoils in horror and she leaves Henry. What do you think's going on there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that she's that's confronting this sense of total enjoyment, right? Like even though she represents it for him, there's a danger to her in that as well. So I think that that's what she's recoiling from.
Do you think that what she's recoiling from is like she's suddenly getting an awareness that she's in Henry's world and that's horrifying?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
And then we immediately go from there to the woman in the radiator who is kind of breaking the rules of cinema language up until this point and suddenly doing a musical number for the audience where she sings into the camera, "In heaven, everything is fine. You've got your good things and I've got mine."
Right.
How do you interpret this song?
Yeah, I mean, that's to me, that's like the ultimate song about fantasy, right? Like you get in fantasy, you get everything you want. But I mean, that's what fantasy promises, but of course it doesn't deliver that.
Now, in probably the film's most complex sequence that I find probably the most difficult to decipher, Henry goes on the stage to meet with her. She opens her hands up like this. He touches them. There's a blinding flash of white light.
Kind of like the Lost Highway light, I think.
Yeah. She suddenly disappears. And then for a flash, he sees the man on the planet. Just for a flash. And then he disappears as well. Why does the man on the planet come back there?
Yeah, I think that's like, isn't it that when you get through the fantasy dissolves for a moment, and then all of a sudden you get this the structuring force that's created his universe becomes apparent at that point, like that, because the fantasy dissolves, and then only very briefly.
Yeah. So after he sees the absence of the woman and the reappearance of the man in the asteroid, he suddenly seems really worried and panicky. Then all of a sudden, a log seems to be pushed out on the middle of the stage. There's blood coming out of the log. Then Henry is suddenly twiddling some sort of a pole behind a curtain. Then his head pops off, goes into the blood on the floor. The baby's head comes out of his head. The baby's crying while his actual head is on the floor covered in blood. And then the head falls into the blood and then goes back out into the Eraserhead outside world. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think so. To me, this is again, he's gotten to this understanding through his fantasy structure, right? Through the radiator lady. But I think what he's understanding is the way that capitalist, like that's an experience of his own castration, clearly, right? Like his head's popped off by the baby. And so sexed reproduction is castration, right? Like that's we're beings of lack, so we have to reproduce ourselves sexually. And then what the film is showing, I think, in a fascinating way, is the way capitalism takes advantage of that and uses that material that's produced by castration for its production processes. So it's almost like, I think the idea is something like you endure reproduction, castration, and we're going to use that suffering as part of what's going to create reproduce capitalist society. So I view that as, again, I think this is one of Lynch's more political moments and one of his more clear, I guess you wouldn't say, but more pronounced critiques of capitalist society.
Yeah, when I first saw this film, for whatever reason, I remember it's a very short film, but I remember experiencing it as quite a long film. And when this sequence happened, I thought, oh, this is the end of the movie.
Right.
And I was quite surprised to see his head fall into the blood and then fall down into the street. Why do you think the head falls down into the street like that?
Yeah, again, I think, isn't it the way, and then it gets picked up and used for the production process, right? I mean, that's the point. Like this interior, this thing that happens psychically or within the family ends up being the thing that feeds the social process of production or and capitalist reproduction. So I think that's, to me, the great thing about the film, that the way the head goes from the one arena to the other arena.
Yeah, so there's a boy that picks it up, brings it to a factory where it's made into erasers. But what's interesting is that there's a almost kind of nonsensical cut. It makes no relevance to anything in terms of the story. But there's a cut to a bum on the ground who looks like he's maybe drunk or on the verge of death. And he's just staring at this boy taking the head to a pencil factory. And the camera just lays on him as he's just laying there in his decrepitude. What do you think that's about?
Yeah, I just think it's showing, isn't Lynch just there showing the cost of this kind of system, right? Like we're seeing, this is the detritus that's also produced by this system of capitalist production.
Okay, so then we go to the pencil and eraser factory. There's obviously a very irate, angry, Frank Booth-like boss, a guy called Paul, who seems like a frightened worker. Then there's another man who supervises the pencils and erasers. They make erasers out of Henry's head. They test the erasers. The erasers seem to work fine. And then the third man, I believe, takes the eraser shavings, blows them off the table, and then we see just this image of the eraser shavings behind blackness. Then that fades back into Henry, and it appears as though he is awakening from a dream. So what do you think the end of the dream, his head being made into erasers, what is that about?
Again, I think that's the way that our castration serves the capitalist system, right? Like that my suffering ends up being this thing that helps to produce, like it makes us buy more, it makes us go get jobs, it makes all these things. And so it ends up like that suffering ends up serving capitalist productivity. And I think that's what is really being shown. And then when the dream ends like that, he only gets that insight through this fantasy. And then then he comes out of the fantasy at the end.
Interesting. So what do you think of the idea of the eraser in particular being a kind of a symbol of potential suicide? You can erase yourself.
Yeah, right. That makes sense to me. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah.
Why do you think the film is called Eraserhead? Why is that symbol so important, even though we see it once?
Yeah. Well, I think in a way the whole film is leading up to that point, right? Like what does it suggest? It suggests that the thing that's most your head, can be made into a product, right? Like to me, that's why it's such a great title for a film. Like it's
interesting. So it doesn't to you signify rubbing oneself out then?
Yeah, that too. I think both those things. to me, both those things are kind of the same.
Okay.
Because in order to become a product, you have to rub yourself out.
Interesting. So then we go back into Henry's apartment, back into his room. Mary's gone. It seems like we're back where we were before the dream began. The baby's quiet, but everything is quite tense. There's still things going on outside of Henry's flat. There's still people beating each other up outside. There's coins, all that kind of stuff. And then he hears the girl across the hall coming back to her flat with another guy who seems a bit sickly and a bit sleazy.
Yep.
He's sort of touching her, fondling her. Henry can see all this because he's opened the door, presumably because he's going to go say hi to the girl across the hall. And then she looks at him and she sees the baby's head on his head.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Yeah, I think, isn't this him confronting, first of all, her enjoyment of the other man, right? Or this other man monopolizing her instead of Henry having her. And then she sees him through the child, right? Like she sees his castration because of the child. And that's what really sets him off, I think, finally.
Interesting. So it's when he looks through the keyhole and there's that shot of the door slamming.
Yeah.
There's a sense that any opportunity with her
It's
is now gone.
Yeah.
And then he looks back up at the baby and the baby's laughing at him. And that's when he takes a pair of scissors out of his drawers, cuts open his baby and stabs it.
Right.
Why is the baby laughing at him, you think?
Well, I think it's just this idea that the baby's laughing at his humiliation, right? Like his inability to do anything, like his inability to realize any of his desire, that's what's humiliating, and that's what I think the baby is, metaphorically laughing at in that scene.
So is this a kind of malevolent baby, you think?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's not sort of an innocent baby?
No, I don't think so.
Interesting. So do you think Henry has good reasons to kill the baby then?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think he's trying to get rid of, I guess yes is the answer, but I think he's trying to get rid of what's blocking his desire, right? Like he's had all these fantasy moments of actually getting to his object. And so killing the baby, he thinks, I'll get rid of this thing that's blocking my desire, but that ends up destroying his entire world. And so it's really a film about the way the obstacle to our desire is necessary for that desire. It's not just this thing that we can get rid of and then get access to the object.
Interesting. So when he kills the baby, it's really, really disgusting.
Yes.
All this white pus flows out everywhere. But then the room itself starts to mechanically malfunction. Sparks are coming out of lights are flickering. Then the baby itself, before it dies, it becomes a giant sperm. And then it becomes like a huge baby that's kind of menacing Henry as the lights are flicking. And it's only at the point where it stops menacing Henry that he can see the planet is burst, the asteroid that the man with the levers is in, that it's burst, and that there's eraser shavings behind his head and he's somehow in outer space. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think that he's like, so the baby is this figure of threatening, malevolent enjoyment, right? And so that's what gets manifested after he kills it. And then he has this moment of ecstasy where he feels like, okay, now I can get to the object myself. But then, as you point out, the whole world actually destroys when he does that.
Yeah, and it seems like the man in the asteroid, he's getting burned by the sparks that he's using to try and control the levers. The levers are out of control.
Out of control, right?
And it looks like even that man is going to die because of what Henry did.
I think you're right that it obliterates everything, because he's tried to like killing the baby is trying to get through to like break through the fantasy and have the object and get out of this horrifying world of desire that he's been stuck in.
So the last shot is he finally goes into this pure white world, which looks exactly like the world he was in when he was dissolved in milk having sex with the girl across the hall.
Right.
Except this time he encounters the lady in the radiator again. She's no longer in the curtain world inside the radiator. They're both in the white world. They embrace, he hugs her, it ends, and we go back to Fats Waller. So what is that embrace about to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that embrace is just about having the object, right? Like for Lynch, I think the main idea is that it's through not having the object that we can enjoy the object. And so this attempt to really have it is always going to lead to disaster. And I think that's what Eraserhead's really chronicling.
Interesting. So do you see the woman in the radiator as an anti-capitalist figure?
Well, yes and no. Like, yeah, in the sense, she's the one that, like, through that fantasy of her, it allows him to see how the capitalist system is functioning. But then the problem is that by trying to have her totally, then he ends up destroying everything. So I think it's kind of, she has a double valence, I would say.
Interesting. So she never at any point becomes threatened by him and wants to move away. Whereas every other character in the film at some point becomes threatened by him and wants to move away. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, again, because I think she's the perfect fantasy object for him.
And a fantasy.
And that's why that's why she won't leave. But that's also why it's so destructive to actually come together with her.
Interesting. So is the ending of Eraserhead a happy ending, or is it a kind of a cautionary tale, don't kill your kids sort of movie?
Yeah, I think cautionary tale. I think that's right.
So what would you have envisioned, let's say, as a happy ending for Henry Spencer in this story? What would be distinct from what we actually saw?
Well, I think it would be a way for him to leave, to find a way to keep the relation with the fantasy while importing that into his real life, right? Like I think that's the lesson of Lynch's films. It's like import the fantasy into the way that you actually live. Don't just keep it as this separate realm of fantasy, but actually don't like, we have this distinction. Don't abide by the distinction. Bring the fantasy world into your real life.
How do you differentiate between fantasy, which is useful for making life better, and a kind of dangerous delusion?
No, I think they're the same. Greg, that's the problem. Like the fantasies that can get us insight and help us to structure our life are also can be deadly. I mean, it's about the relationship one takes up to the fantasy, I think, not the like, oh, let's make sure we have good fantasies and not bad ones.
So no fantasy is ever going to be good, really.
Right. Correct.
It's only good or bad depending on what you take from it.
Right.
So if the baby was malevolent, is there a sense in which it needed to die? Because the entire world is being sustained by something malevolent, so the world has to go. Right.
I mean, I think that's probably true. I don't think killing the baby is so much the problem as his belief that by killing the baby, he can access the object totally. Like that, I think that's the problem.
Interesting. So do you see Henry as somebody who alienated Mary and was a bad partner, and that's why she's gone?
No. He's totally a victim, I think, in the sequence. Yeah.
Interesting. So why do you think Mary is so upset with him throughout the film?
Well, I think it's because everyone's so upset, right? Like they live in a world that's fundamentally disappointing. And so her disappointment with him, like, we're mainly in his subjectivity. And so her disappointment in him is what forces this like total disappointment that surrounds Henry.
Interesting. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. So everyone, you're right, is kind of disappointed with him. he seems like the sort of person who, if you were to follow him into Lapel's factory, his boss would be disappointed with him too.
Right.
But there's also something interesting about the film, again, being about his vacation.
Right.
So it's about his life outside of the production process. You know, presumably during.
Right. So, like, in a sense, Greg, the idea is you never really get outside of it, right? Like, even when you're on vacation, you end up being caught up in it. Right.
Yeah. Well, it seems like he's living in a world, regardless of how this world exists ontologically or where it exists or when it exists, I don't know. But it feels like he's living in a world where even if you said, okay, everybody who's working, we're going to give you basic income now, you can do whatever you want for a year, you don't have to work, everybody would still be miserable.
Right. Correct. Absolutely correct.
So what is it about that world that doesn't allow for human flourishing, even when you give people vacations and money and time to themselves?
Well, what I would say, and I think this is maybe the lesson of Lynch's whole oeuvre, is that it's what I just said before, that fantasy is kept out. It's a separate place, and you're not allowing the enjoyment that fantasy produces to come into your actual life. And so then your life is barren and miserable.
Interesting. So would you say that, like, giving people free time, free money, higher wages, more time off, that's not necessarily going to make people's lives better?
Well, no, I mean, I think that all those things are fine. And clearly the conditions of the working class should be radically ameliorated. But I do think that there's a way that the most destructive thing about capitalist society is the way that it partitions fantasy off as a separate world. And like, you go to this, like, even the way vacation is structured, right? Like, it's totally separate from work. So you're supposed to just go and totally enjoy yourself. So there's not the way in which the enjoyment of fantasy is integrated into your actual living of your life.
Interesting. So there's almost like a superego injunction to enjoy yourself when you're on vacation in the Bahamas.
When you're on vacation, but then you're not allowed to do it at all when you're in your ordinary life. Yeah.
Yeah, and that makes your vacation in the Bahamas quite stressful. Right. And it makes your ordinary life lack enjoyment too.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting. So how do you think we better integrate fantasy and enjoyment into our lives, whether we have time off or not? It's like, how is...
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a good question, Greg. I don't know. I try to do that myself. I don't have a great answer for that. I just can talk about how it works theoretically, but I don't have a good answer about how to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's one of life's grand mysteries, really. Like,
right.
You know, because there are some people, and maybe there's some diversity about how people do it. Like, some people say, I really love my job because work is play. Right. Some people are like, well, no, I like to work hard and then play hard.
Right.
And then other people are like, well, I don't really like vacations because I really love what I do. A lot of successful artists probably would say, you know, why would I want to take a break from writing my novel and go into the Bahamas when I can?
Yeah, I think Lynch feels that way. Right. So that's maybe close to what he would say.
So is there a right way of doing it, or are we all just...
Well, something like that, I think, Greg, like viewing your life itself as a work of art, and no matter what your job is. I mean, it's harder, obviously, if your job is... I've worked as a janitor before. It's pretty hard to view that as part of a work of art, but I think you can. So
some people do.
Like yeah.
It's really difficult when you kind of talk about fantasy versus how to make the capitalist economy better, because there is a kind of material conditions question. How do you produce human flourishing?
Sure.
But then there's this psychological dimension, which is, well, even if you improve the material conditions, you've still got something left over you've got to fix.
Absolutely.
And it's this relationship between desire and fantasy.
Right.
Free time is not going to fix that.
Absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely right.
So I suppose to end this, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for doing this with me. I've wanted to talk to you for many years, and I'm very happy.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay.
And is there anything that you would like to say to our audience about your next projects or books, or what you're working on now, so we can check in with you with your next book or whatever it's going to be?
Yeah, I have a little book called The Racist Fantasy that just got accepted yesterday. So that'll be my next one that comes out. So that's it. Yeah, it's actually It's interesting because it's definitely about the negative side. We've talked a lot about fantasy as a positive thing today, and so this is about a very negative fantasy, which is the way fantasy works in racism.
So, like, what would be an example of a racism fantasy as opposed to a racist fantasy?
Well, I only talk about the racist fantasy. So the idea is this: that the fantasizing subject fantasizes a racial other that is an obstacle to them getting to the object of desire. So it's kind of what we've been talking about today a lot. But the point is that the obstacle is the racial other, and that's what makes it a racist fantasy.
Interesting. Well, I'll be looking forward to that when it comes out. I'd love to talk to you about that when that one's finished as well.
That sounds good, Greg. It's great talking to you today.
You too. Thanks so much. The book we were talking about, for those of you who forgot, is The Impossible David Lynch from Dr. Todd McGowan. Check it out from Amazon and other places when you can. This was a really lovely conversation. Thanks so much. And I hope to talk to you again sometime. Okay?
I hope so too, Greg. Great talking to you.
This is Greg Scorzo, and that was the Culture on the Offensive podcast. If you like this podcast, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're interested in any of the other things that we do at Coda Publishing, check us out at www.cultureontheoffensive.com. So stay safe, be courageous, and don't forget to go outside of your comfort zone. And remember, when you hear things that sound wrong or silly or stupid or strange, don't forget to use empathy, clarity, and courage.